Old House in Vauxhall Walk by Charlotte Riddell. Chapter 1. Houseless, homeless, hopeless. Many a one who had before him trodden that same street must have uttered the same words. The weary, the desolate, the hungry, the forsaken, the waifs and strays of struggling humanity that are always coming and going, cold, starving and miserable over the pavements of Lambeth parish. But it is open to question whether they were ever previously spoken with a more thorough conviction of their truth, or with a feeling of keener self-pity than by the young man who hurried along Vauxhall Walk one rainy winter's night with no overcoat on his shoulders and no hat on his head. A strange sentence for 21 to give expression to, and it was stranger still to come from the lips of a person who looked like, and who was, a gentleman. He did not appear either to have sunk very far down in the good graces of fortune. There was no sign or token which would have induced a passer-by to imagine he had been worsted after a long fight with calamity. His boots were not worn down at the heels or broken at the toes, as many, many boots were, which dragged and shuffled and scraped along the pavement. His clothes were good and fashionably cut, and innocent of the rents and patches and tatters that slunk wretchedly by, crouched in doorways, and held out a hand mutely appealing for charity. His face was not pinched with famine, or lined with wicked wrinkles, or brutalized by drink and debauchery, and yet he said and thought he was hopeless, and almost in his young despair spoke the words aloud. It was a bad night to be about with such a feeling in one's heart. The rain was cold, pitiless, and increasing. The damp, keen wind blew down the cross streets leading from the river. The fumes of the gasworks seemed to fall with the rain. The road was muddy, the pavement greasy, the lamps burned dimly, and that dreary district of London looked its very gloomiest and worst. Certainly not an evening to be abroad without a home to go to, or sixpence in one's pocket. Yet this was the position of a young gentleman who, without a hat, strode along Vauxhall Walk, the rain beating on his unprotected head. Upon the houses, so large and good, once inhabited by well-to-do citizens, now let out for the most part in floors to weekly tenants, he looked enviously. He would have given much to have had a room, or even part of one. He had been walking for a long time, ever since dark in fact, and dark falls soon in December. He was tired and cold and hungry, and he saw no prospect save of pacing the streets all night. As he passed one of the lamps, the light, falling on his face, revealed handsome young features, a mobile, sensitive mouth, and that particular formation of the eyebrows, not a frown exactly, but a certain draw of the brows, often considered to bespeak genius, but which more surely accompanies an impulsive organization, easily pleased, easily depressed, capable of suffering very keenly or of enjoying fully. In his short life he had not enjoyed much, and he had suffered a good deal. That night, when he walked bareheaded through the rain, affairs had come to a crisis. So far as he in his despair felt able to see or reason, the best thing he could do was to die. The world did not want him. He would be better out of it. The door of one of the houses stood open, and he could see in the dimly lighted hall some few articles of furniture waiting to be removed. A van stood beside the curb, and two men were lifting a table into it as he for a second paused. Ah, he thought, even those poor people have some place to go to, some shelter provided, while I have not a roof to cover my head, or a shilling to get a night's lodging. And he went on fast, as if memory was spurring him, so fast that a man running after had some trouble to overtake him. "Master Graham! Master Graham!" this man exclaimed breathlessly, and thus addressed, the young fellow stopped, as if he had been shot. "Who are you that know me?" he asked, facing round. "I'm William. Don't you remember William, Master Graham? And Lord's sake, sir, What are you doing out on a night like this without your hat?" "I forgot it," was the answer, "and I didn't care to go back and fetch it." "Then why don't you buy another, sir? You'll catch your death of cold, and besides, you'll excuse me, sir, but it does look odd." "I know that," said Master Graham grimly, "but I haven't a halfpenny in the world." "Have you and the master then—" began the man, but there he hesitated and stopped. "Had a quarrel?" "Yes, and one that will last us our lives," finished the other with a bitter laugh. "And where are you going now?" "Going? Nowhere, except to seek out the softest paving stone or the shelter of an arch." "You're joking, sir." "I don't feel much in the mood for jesting either." "Will you come back with me, Master Graham? We're just at the last of our moving, but there's a spark of fire still in the grate, and it would be better talking out of this rain." "Will you come, sir? Come?" "Of course I'll come," said the young fellow, and turning, they retraced their steps to the house he had looked into as he passed along. An old, old house, with long, wide hall, stairs low, easy of ascent, with deep cornices to the ceilings, and oak floorings, and mahogany doors which still spoke mutely of the wealth and stability of the original owner, who had lived before the Tradescants and Ashmoles were thought of, and had been sleeping far longer than they, in St. Mary's churchyard, hard by the Archbishop's palace. "Step upstairs, sir," entreated the departing tenant. "It's cold down here, with the door standing wide." "Had you the whole house then, William?" asked Graham Coulton in some surprise. "The whole of it, and right sorry I, for one, am to leave it, but nothing else would serve my wife. This room, sir." And with little conscious pride, William, doing the honours of his late residence, asked his guest into a spacious apartment occupying the full width of the house on the first floor. Tired though he was, the young man could not repress an exclamation of astonishment. "Why, we have nothing so large as this at home, William," he said. "It's a fine house," answered William, raking the embers together as he spoke and throwing some wood upon them. "But, like many a good family, it has come down in the world." There were 4 windows in the room, shuttered close. They had deep, low seats, suggestive of pleasant days gone by, when, well curtained and well cushioned, they formed snug retreats for the children, and sometimes for adults also. There was no furniture left, unless an oaken settle beside the hearth and a large mirror let into the panelling at the opposite end of the apartment, with a black marble console table beneath it, could be so considered. But the very absence of chairs and tables enabled the magnificent proportions of the chamber to be seen to full advantage, and there was nothing to distract the attention from the ornamented ceiling, the panelled walls, the old-world chimney-piece so quaintly carved, and the fireplace lined with tiles, each one of which contained a picture of some scriptural or allegorical subject. "Had you been staying on here, William," said Coulton, flinging himself wearily on the settle, "I'd have asked you to let me stop where I am for the night." "If you can make shift, sir, there's nothing, as I am aware of, to prevent you stopping," answered the man, fanning the wood into a flame. "I shan't take the key back to the landlord till tomorrow, and this will be better for you than the cold streets at any rate." "Do you really mean what you say?" asked the other eagerly. "I should be thankful to lie here. I feel dead beat." "Then stay, Master Graham, and welcome. I'll fetch a basket of coals I was going to put in the van and make up a good fire so that you can warm yourself. Then I must run round to the other house for a minute or two, but it's not far, and I'll be back as soon as ever I can." "Thank you, William. You were always good to me," said the young man gratefully. "This is delightful." And he stretched his numbed hands over the blazing wood and looked round the room with a satisfied smile. "I didn't expect to get into such quarters," he remarked, as his friend in need reappeared, carrying a half-bushel basket full of coals, with which he proceeded to make up a roaring fire. "I'm sure the last thing I could have imagined was meeting with anyone I knew in Vauxhall Walk." "Where were you coming from, Master Graham?" asked William curiously. "From old Melfield's. I was at his school once, you know, and he's now retired, and is living upon the proceeds of years of robbery in Kennington Oval. I thought perhaps he would lend me £1, or offer me a night's lodgings, or even a glass of wine. But oh dear, no. He took the moral tone, and observed he could have nothing to say to a son who defied his father's authority. He gave me plenty of advice, but nothing else. and showed me out into the rain with a bland courtesy for which I could have struck him. William muttered something under his breath which was not a blessing, and added aloud, "You're better here, sir, I think. At any rate, I'll be back in less than half an hour." Left to himself, young Coulton took off his coat and, shifting the settle a little, hung it over the end to dry. With his handkerchief he rubbed some of the wet out of his hair. Then, perfectly exhausted, he lay down before the fire and, pillowing his hand on his arm, fell fast asleep. He was awakened nearly an hour afterwards by the sound of someone gently stirring the fire and moving quietly about the room. Starting into a sitting posture, he looked around him, bewildered for a moment, and then, recognizing his humble friend, said, laughing, "I lost myself. I couldn't imagine where I was." "I'm sorry to see you here, sir," was the reply, "but still this is better than being out of doors. It's come on a nasty night. I brought a rug round with me that perhaps you could wrap yourself in." "I wish at the same time you had brought me something to eat," said the young man, laughing. "Are you hungry then, sir?" asked William in a tone of concern. "Yes, I've had nothing to eat since breakfast. The governor and I commenced rowing the minute we sat down to luncheon, and I rose and left the table. But hunger does not signify. I'm dry and warm, and I can forget the other matter in sleep." "And it's too late now to buy anything," soliloquized the man. "The shops are all shut long ago. Do you think, sir," he added, brightening, "you could manage some bread and cheese?" "Do I think? I should call it a perfect feast," answered Graham Coulton. "But never mind about food tonight, William. You have had trouble enough and to spare already." William's only answer was to dart to the door and run downstairs. Presently he reappeared, carrying in one hand bread and cheese wrapped up in paper, and in the other a pewter measure full of beer. "It's the best I could do, sir," he said apologetically. "I had to beg this from the landlady." "Here's to her good health," exclaimed the young fellow gaily, taking a long pull at the tankard. "This tastes better than champagne in my father's house." "Won't he be uneasy about you?" ventured William, who, having by this time emptied the coals, was now seated on the inverted basket, looking wistfully at the relish with which the son of the former master was eating his bread and cheese. "No," was the decided answer. "When he hears it pouring cats and dogs, he'll only hope I am out in the deluge, and say a good drenching will cool my pride." "I don't think you're right there," remarked the man. "But I am sure I am. My father always hated me, as he hated my mother." "Begging your pardon, sir, he was over fond of your mother." "If you had heard what he said about her today, you might find reason to alter your opinion. He told me I resembled her in mind as well as body, that I was a coward, a simpleton, and a hypocrite." "He didn't mean it, sir." "He did, every word. He does think I'm a coward because I... And the young fellow broke into a passion of hysterical tears. "I don't half like leaving you here alone," said William, glancing round the room with a quick trouble in his eyes. "But I have no place fit to ask you to stop, and I'm forced to go myself because I'm night watchman and must be on at 12 o'clock. "I shall be right enough," was the answer, "only I mustn't talk any more of my father. Tell me about yourself, William. How did you manage to get such a big house, and why are you leaving it?" "The landlord put me in charge, sir, and it was my wife's fancy not to like it." "Why did she not like it?" "She felt desolate alone with the children at night," answered William, turning away his head, then added next minute, "Now, sir, if you think I can do no more for you, I'd best be off. The time's getting on. I'll look round tomorrow morning." "Good night," said the young fellow, stretching out his hand, which the other took as freely and frankly as it was offered. "What should I have done this evening if I'd not chanced to meet you?" "I don't think there is much chance in the world, Master Graham," was the quiet answer. "I do hope you'll rest well and not be the worse for your wetting." "No fear of that," was the rejoinder. And the next minute the young man found himself all alone in the old house in Vauxhall Walk. 2. Lying on the settle, with the fire burnt out, and the room in total darkness, Graham Coulton dreamed a curious dream. He thought he awoke from deep slumber to find a log smouldering away upon the hearth, and the mirror at the end of the apartment reflecting fitful gleams of light. He couldn't understand how it came to pass that far away as he was from the glass, he was able to see everything in it, but he resigned himself to the difficulty without astonishment, as people generally do in dreams. Neither did he feel surprised when he beheld the outline of a female figure seated beside the fire, engaged in picking something out of her lap and dropping it with a despairing gesture. He heard the mellow sound of gold and knew she was lifting and dropping sovereigns. He turned a little so as to see the person engaged in such a singular and meaningless manner, and found that where there had been no chair on the previous night, there was a chair now, on which was seated an old wrinkled hag, her clothes poor and ragged, a mob cap barely covering her scant white hair, her cheeks sunken, her nose hooked, her fingers more like talons than aught else, as they dived down into the heap of gold, portions of which they lifted but to scatter mournfully. "Oh, my lost life," she moaned in a voice of bitterest anguish. "Oh, my lost life, for one day, for 1 hour of it again." Out of the darkness, out of the corner of the room where the shadows lay deepest, out from the gloom abiding near the door, out from the dreary night with their sodden feet and wet dripping from their heads, came the old men and the young children, the worn women and the weary hearts whose misery that gold might have relieved, but whose wretchedness it mocked. Round that miser, who once sat gloating as she now sat lamenting, they crowded, all those pale, sad shapes, the aged of days, the infant of hours, the sobbing outcast, honest poverty, repentant vice. But one low cry proceeded from those pale lips, a cry for help she might have given, but which she withheld. They closed about her all together as they had done singly in life. They prayed, they sobbed, they entreated. With haggard eyes the figure regarded the poor she had repulsed, the children against whose cries she had closed her ears, the old people she had suffered to starve and die, for want of which would have been the merest trifle to her. Then, with a terrible scream, she raised her lean arms above her head and sank down, down, the gold scattering as it fell out of her lap and rolling along the floor till its gleam was lost in the outer darkness beyond. Then Graham Coulton awoke in good earnest, with the perspiration oozing from every pore, with a fear and an agony upon him such as he had never before felt in all his existence, and with the sound of the heart-rending cry, "Oh, my lost life!" still ringing in his ears. Mingled with all, too, there seemed to have been some lesson for him which he had forgotten, that, try as he would, eluded his memory, and which, in the very act of waking, glided away. He lay for a little while thinking about all this, and then, still heavy with sleep, retraced his way into dreamland once more. It was natural, perhaps, that mingling with the strange fantasies which follow in the train of night and darkness, the former vision should recur, and the young man ere long found himself toiling through scene after scene wherein the figure of the woman he had seen seated beside a dying fire held principal place. He saw her walking slowly across the floor, munching a dry crust, she who could have purchased all the luxuries wealth can command. On the hearth, contemplating her, stood a man of commanding presence, dressed in the fashion of long ago. In his eyes there was a dark look of anger, on his lips a curling smile of disgust. And somehow, even in his sleep, the dreamer understood it was the ancestor to the descendant he beheld, that the house put to mean uses in which he lay had never so far descended from its higher state, as the woman possessed of so pitiful a soul, contaminated with the most despicable and insidious vice poor humanity knows, for all other vices seem to have connection with the flesh, but the greed of the miser eats into the very soul. Filthy of person, repulsive to look at, hard of heart as she was, he yet beheld another phantom, which, coming into the room, met her almost on the threshold, taking her by the hand and pleading, as it seemed, for assistance. He couldn't hear all that passed, but a word now and then fell upon his ear, some talk of former days, some mention of a fair young mother, an appeal, as it seemed, to a time when they were tiny brother and sister, and the accursed greed for gold had not divided them. All in vain. The hag only answered him as she had answered the children and the young girls and the old people in his former vision. Her heart was as invulnerable to natural affection as it had proved to human sympathy. He begged, as it appeared, for aid to avert some bitter misfortune or terrible disgrace, and adamant might have been found more yielding to his prayer. Then the figure standing on the hearth changed to an angel, which folded its wings mournfully over its face, and the man with bowed head slowly left the room. Even as he did so, the scene changed again. It was night once more, and the miser wended her way upstairs. From below, Graham Coulton fancied he watched her toiling wearily from step to step. She had aged strangely since the previous scenes. She moved with difficulty. It seemed the greatest exertion for her to creep from step to step, her skinny hand traversing the balusters with slow and painful deliberateness. Fascinated, the young man's eyes followed the progress of that feeble, decrepit woman. She was solitary in a desolate house, with a deeper blackness than the darkness of night waiting to engulf her. It seemed to Graham Coulton that after that he lay for a long time in a still dreamless sleep, upon waking from which he found himself entering a chamber as sordid and unclean in its appointments as the woman of his previous vision had been in her person. The poorest labourer's wife would have gathered more comforts around her than that room contained. A four-poster bedstead without hangings of any kind, a blind drawn up awry, an old carpet covered with dust and dirt on the floor, a rickety washstand with all the paint worn off it, an ancient mahogany dressing table, and a cracked glass spotted all over, were all the objects he could at first discern, looking at the room through that dim light which oftentimes obtains in dreams. By degrees, however, he perceived the outline of someone lying huddled on the bed. Drawing nearer, he found it was that of the person whose dreadful presence seemed to pervade the house. What a terrible sight she looked, with her thin white locks scattered over the pillow, with what were mere remnants of blankets gathered about her shoulders, with her claw-like fingers clutching the clothes, as though even in sleep she was guarding her gold. An awful and a repulsive spectacle, but not with half the terror in it of that which followed. Even as the young man looked, he heard stealthy footsteps on the stairs. Then he saw first one man, and then his fellow, steal cautiously into the room. Another second, and the pair stood beside the bed, murder in their eyes. Graham Coulton tried to shout, tried to move, but the deterrent power which exists in dreams only tied his tongue and paralyzed his limbs. He could but hear and look, and what he heard and saw was this. Aroused suddenly from sleep, the woman started, only to receive a blow from one of the ruffians, whose fellow followed his lead by plunging a knife into her breast. Then, with a gurgling scream, she fell back on the bed, and at that same moment, with a cry, Graham Coulton again awoke. To thank heaven, it was but an illusion. 3. I hope you slept well, sir. It was William who, coming into the hall with the sunlight of a fine bright morning streaming after him, asked this question. Had you a good night's rest? Graham Coulton laughed and answered, Why, faith, I was somewhat in the case of Paddy, who couldn't sleep for dreaming. I slept well enough, I suppose, but whether it was in consequence of the row with my dad, or the hard bed, or the cheese, most likely the bread and cheese so late at night, I dreamt all the night long of the most extraordinary dreams. Some old woman kept cropping up, and I saw her murdered. You don't say that, sir, said William nervously. I do indeed, was the reply. However, that's all gone and past. I've been down in the kitchen and have had a good wash, and I'm as fresh as a daisy and hungry as a hunter, and, oh, William, can you get me any breakfast? Certainly, Master Graham. I've brought round a kettle, and I'll make the water boil immediately. I suppose, sir, this tentatively, you'll be going home today. Home? Repeated the young man. Decidedly not. I'll never go home again till I return with some medal hung to my coat, or a leg or an arm cut off. I've thought it all out, William. I'll go and enlist. There's talk of a war, and living or dead, my father shall have reason to retract his opinion about my being a coward. I'm sure the Admiral never thought you anything of the sort, sir, said William. Why, you have the pluck of 10. Not before him, answered the young fellow sadly. You'll do nothing rash, Master Graham. You won't go listing or aught of that sort in your anger. If I don't, what's to become of me? Asked the other. I cannot dig to beg. I'm ashamed. Why, but for you, I shouldn't have had a roof over my head last night. Not much of a roof, I'm afraid, sir. Not much of a roof, repeated the young man. Why, who could desire a better? What a capital room this is, he went on, looking around the apartment, where William was now kindling a fire. One might dine 20 people here easily. If you think so well of the place, Master Graham, you might stay here for a while, till you've made up your mind what you're going to do. The landlord won't make any objection, I'm very sure. Oh, nonsense. He would want a long rent for a house like this. I dare say, if he could get it, was William's significant answer. What do you mean? Won't the place let? No, sir. I didn't tell you last night, but there was a murder done here, and people are shy of the house ever since. A murder? What sort of murder? Who was murdered? A woman, Master Graham, the landlord's sister. She lived here all alone and was supposed to have money. Whether she had or not, she was found dead from a stab in her breast, and if there ever was any money, it must have been taken at the same time, for none was ever found in the house from that day to this. Was that the reason your wife wouldn't stop here? Asked the young man, leaning against the mantel shelf and looking thoughtfully down on William. Yes, sir. She couldn't stand it any longer. She got that thin and nervous no one would have believed it possible. She never saw anything, but she said she heard footsteps and voices, and then when she walked through the hall or up the staircase, someone always seemed to be following her. We put the children to sleep in that big room you had last night, and they declared they often saw an old woman sitting by the hearth. Nothing ever came my way, finished William with a laugh. I was always ready to go to sleep the minute my head touched the pillow. Were not the murderers discovered? Asked Graham Coulton. No, sir, the landlord, Miss Tynan's brother, had always lain under the suspicion of it, quite wrongfully, I'm very sure, but he'll never clear himself now. It was known he came and asked her for help a day or two before the murder, and it was also known he was able within a week or two to weather whatever trouble had been harassing him. Then, you see, the money was never found, and altogether people scarce knew what to think. Ejaculated Graham Coulton, and he took a few turns up and down the apartment. Could I go and see this landlord? Surely, sir, if you had a hat, answered William, with such a serious decorum that the young man burst out laughing. That is an obstacle, certainly, he remarked, and I must make a note do instead. I have a pencil in my pocket, so here goes. Within half an hour from the dispatch of that note, William was back again with a sovereign, the landlord's compliments, and he would be much obliged if Mr. Coulton could step round. You'll do nothing rash, sir, entreated William. Why, man, answered the young fellow, one may as well be picked off by a ghost as a bullet. What is there to be afraid of? William only shook his head. He didn't think his young master was made of the stuff likely to remain alone in a haunted house and solve the mystery it assuredly contained by dint of his own unassisted endeavours. And yet, when Graham Coulton came out of the landlord's house, he looked more bright and gay than usual, and walked up the Lambeth Road to the place where William awaited his return, humming an air as he paced along. "We've settled the matter," he said, "and now if the dad wants his son for Christmas, it'll trouble him to find him." "Don't say that, Master Graham, don't," entreated the man with a shiver. "Maybe after all it would have been better if you'd never happened to chance upon Vauxhall Walk." "Don't croak, William," answered the young man. "If it was not the best day's work I ever did for myself, I'm a Dutchman. During the whole of that forenoon and afternoon, Graham Coulton searched diligently for the missing treasure Mr. Tynan assured him had never been discovered. Youth is confident and self-opinionated, and this fresh explorer felt satisfied that, though others had failed, he would be successful. On the second floor, he found one door locked, but he didn't pay much attention to that at the moment, as he believed if there was anything concealed, it was more likely to be found in the lower than the upper part of the house. Late into the evening, he pursued his researches in the kitchen and cellars and old-fashioned cupboards, of which the basement had an abundance. It was nearly 11 when, engaged in poking about amongst the empty bins of a wine cellar as large as a family vault, he suddenly felt a rush of cold air at his back. Moving, his candle was instantly extinguished, and in the very moment of being left in darkness, he saw, standing in the doorway, a woman resembling her who had haunted his dreams overnight. He rushed with outstretched hands to seize her, but clutched only air. He relit his candle and closely examined the basement, shutting off communication with the ground floor ere doing so. All in vain. Not a trace could he find of living creature. Not a window was opened. Not a door unbolted. It is very odd, he thought, as, after securely fastening the door at the top of the staircase, he searched the whole upper portion of the house, with the exception of the one room mentioned. I must get the key of that tomorrow, he decided, standing gloomily with his back to the fire and his eyes wandering about the drawing room, where he had once again taken up his abode. Even as the thought passed through his mind, he saw standing in the open doorway a woman with white, dishevelled hair, clad in mean garments, ragged and dirty. She lifted her hand and shook it at him with a menacing gesture, and then, just as he was darting towards her, a wonderful thing occurred. From behind the great mirror there glided a second female figure, at the sight of which the first turned and fled, uttering piercing shrieks as the other followed her from story to story. Sick almost with terror, Graham Coulton watched the dreadful pair as they fled upstairs past the locked room to the top of the house. It was a few minutes before he recovered his self-possession. When he did so and searched the upper apartments, he found them totally empty. That night, here lying down before the fire, he carefully locked and bolted the drawing-room door. Before he did more, he drew the heavy settle in front of it, so that if the lock were forced, no entrance could be effected without considerable noise. For some time he lay awake, then dropped into a deep sleep, from which he was awakened suddenly by a noise as if of something scuffling stealthily behind the wainscot. He raised himself on his elbow and listened, and to his consternation beheld seated at the opposite side of the hearth the same woman he had seen before in his dreams, lamenting over her gold. The fire was not quite out, and at that moment shot up a last tongue of flame. By the light, transient as it was, he saw that the figure pressed a ghostly finger to its lips, and by the turn of its head and the attitude of its body seemed to be listening. He listened also. Indeed, he was too much frightened to do aught else. More and more distinct grew the sounds which had aroused him, a stealthy rustling coming nearer and nearer, up and up it seemed, behind the wainscot. "It is rats," thought the young man, though indeed his teeth were almost chattering in his head with fear. But then in a moment he saw what disabused him of that idea. The gleam of a candle or lamp through a crack in the panelling. He tried to rise, he strove to shout, all in vain, and sinking down remembered nothing more till he awoke to find the grey light of an early morning stealing through one of the shutters he had left partially unclosed. For hours after his breakfast, which he scarcely touched, long after William had left him at midday, Graham Coulton, having in the morning made a long and close survey of the house, sat thinking before the fire. Then, apparently having made up his mind, he put on the hat he had bought and went out. When he returned, the evening shadows were darkening down, but the pavements were full of people going marketing, for it was Christmas Eve, and all who had money to spend seemed bent on shopping. It was terribly dreary inside the old house that night. Through the deserted rooms, Graham could feel that ghostly semblance was wandering mournfully. When he turned his back, he knew she was flitting from the mirror to the fire, from the fire to the mirror. But he was not afraid of her now. He was far more afraid of another matter he had taken in hand that day. The horror of the silent house grew and grew upon him. He could hear the beating of his own heart in the dead quietude which reigned from garret to cellar. At last William came, but the young man said nothing to him of what was on his mind. He talked to him cheerfully, and hopefully enough wondered where his father would think he'd got to, and hoped Mr. Tynan might send him some Christmas pudding. Then the man said it was time for him to go, and when Mr. Coulton went downstairs to the hall door, remarked the key was not in it. "No," was the answer. I took it out today to oil it." "It wanted oiling," agreed William, "for it worked terribly stiff." Having uttered which truism, he departed. Very slowly the young man retraced his way to the drawing-room, where he only paused to lock the door on the outside. Then, taking off his boots, he went up to the top of the house, where, entering the front attic, he waited patiently, in darkness and in silence. It was a long time, or at least it seemed long to him, before he heard the same sound which had aroused him on the previous night, a stealthy rustling, then a rush of cold air, then cautious footsteps, then the quiet opening of a door below. It did not take as long in action as it is required to tell. In a moment the young man was out on the landing and had closed a portion of the panelling on the wall which stood open. Noiselessly he crept back to the attic window, unlatched it, and sprung a rattle, the sound of which echoed far and near through the deserted streets. Then, rushing down the stairs, he encountered a man who, darting past him, made for the landing above, but perceiving the way of escape closed, fled down again, to find Graham struggling desperately with his fellow. "Give him the knife, come along," he said savagely, and next instant Graham felt something like a hot iron through his shoulder, and then heard a thud as one of the men, tripping in his rapid flight, fell from the top of the stairs to the bottom. At the same moment there came a crash, as if the house was falling, and faint, sick and bleeding, young Coulton lay insensible on the threshold of the room where Miss Tynan had been murdered. When he recovered, he was in the dining room, and a doctor was examining his wound. Near the door a policeman stiffly kept guard. The hall was full of people. All the misery and vagabondism the streets contain at that hour was crowding in to see what had happened. Through the midst 2 men were being conveyed to the station house, one with his head dreadfully injured on a stretcher, the other handcuffed, uttering frightful imprecations as he went. After a time the house was cleared of the rabble, the police took possession of it, and Mr. Tynan was sent for. "What was that dreadful noise?" asked Graham feebly, now seated on the floor with his back resting against the wall. "I don't know. Was there a noise?" said Mr. Tynan, humouring his fancy, as he thought. "Yes, in the drawing-room, I think. The key's in my pocket." Still humouring the wounded lad, Mr. Tynan took the key and ran upstairs. When he unlocked the door, what a sight met his eyes! The mirror had fallen. It was lying all over the floor, shivered into 1,000 pieces. The console table had been borne down by its weight, and the marble slab was shattered as well. But this was not what chained his attention. Hundreds, thousands of gold pieces were scattered about, and an aperture behind the glass contained boxes filled with securities and deeds and bonds, the possession of which had cost his sister her life. "Well, Graham, and what do you want?" asked Admiral Coulton that evening, as his eldest born appeared before him, looking somewhat pale, but otherwise unchanged. "I want nothing," was the answer, "but to ask your forgiveness." William has told me all the story I never knew before, and if you let me, I'll try to make it up to you for the trouble you've had. I am provided for, went on the young fellow with a nervous laugh. I've made my fortune since I left you, and another man's fortune as well. I think you're out of your senses, said the Admiral shortly. No, sir, I have found them, was the answer, and I mean to strive and make a better thing of my life than I should ever have done had I not gone to the old house in Vauxhall Walk. Vauxhall Walk? What's the lad talking about? I will tell you, sir, if I may sit down, was Graham Coulton's answer. And then he told his story.
Everybody does. Everybody does. Isn't that so?
You've tried to get into the wrong house.
So we've recently done another story by Charlotte Riddell, but because it went down so well, and because it's this time of year and the back end of the year when it's getting dark, people seem to really like the Victorian stories. So I will do some more modern stuff, or maybe even some older stuff, but at the moment what we've got tonight is a Victorian story. So Charlotte Riddell, as we know, was born in 1832 and died in 1906. She was born in County Antrim in Ireland. She was known as a novelist of the city. She was a very famous Victorian female novelist, and her breakthrough came in 1864 with her novel George Geath of Fen Court, which sounds a little bit gothic, doesn't it? But she became she was famous, and that story was about London's financial district, and this is why she was known as the novelist of the city, because the city is the financial area of London, the city of London. Yeah. So her work fell out of fashion in the 1890s, and she became Baroque, and so that she was given a stipend by the Society, or a pension by the Society of Authors in 1901. But her final years were marked by ill health, and she passed away in London. However, she was very prolific. She wrote over 40 novels and numerous short stories. From 1861, at the height of her success, she was the co-proprietor and editor of St. James magazine. This story comes from towards the end of her successful period. So The Old House in Vauxhall Walk was first published in 1882 as part of Charlotte Riddell's collection Weird Stories, issued by London-based J.C. Nimmo Publishers. There were 6 supernatural tales, and they were well received and helped solidify her reputation as a skilled author of ghost stories. She fell out of favour, and then she got a second lease of life in the late 1980s when Richard Dolby, who was a great editor of ghost story anthologies in the 80s, he produced the Virago Book of Victorian Ghost Stories, which did really well, and that was 1988. And a lot of people then started to hear of her, and I always find that when I do a Charlotte Riddell story, it goes down really well. People really like them, and I think it's not Henry James, it's not Enid Wharton. It's not high literature, but it's a fun yarn. We get what we like, and as people said, the famous Hollywood thing is people go and they go, I want something like that, just different, So we want the same thing, but different enough so that it feels fresh. Let's, so the story. It is, I'm very much into Gothic at the moment, and the story of my Gothic obsession goes, I do a podcast about ghost stories, so it's kind of, I'm in that territory anyway. And then I got kind of interested in the late 18th century, 1760s, and then 1790s efflorescence of Gothic, and then into the early 1800s, and I wanted to do a course on it, but I couldn't afford it because it's about £10,000 a year to study, and that isn't even to live, that's just to study. So I thought, I'll tell you what, I'll get myself a lot of books. So I've been buying academic books about Gothic, and so if you hear me talk about the Gothic a lot, it's because that's my current thing. So the Gothic tropes, so the ghost story emerges as a subgenre of the Gothic, in a sense that detective story is also a subgenre of the Gothic, particularly sort of pose, sensation tales, and there is a direct lineage from something like The Monk in the 1790s by Monk Lewis, and the shockingness of that, and the slasher films of the 1980s and the serial killer stories of the 2010s, really. You know, there's a direct lineage, and so the ghost story is one of those children of the Gothic, really, which focuses on ghosts rather than many of the other things. But it keeps a lot of the tropes. So the Gothic story is always tends to be set in an antiquated and old building, typically in the early days a castle or a monastery. In this case, it's an old mansion. Probably, if she wrote it in 1880s and it was old then, it's probably pre-Georgian. You know, it may be early. Yeah, sort of certainly 18th century, if not 17th century, where it is. I don't know about. I could look it up. The development of Lambeth and Southwark and places like that, when that was built up, but I think it's probably Georgian, really. Anyway, we don't know. The house is in fact fictional; it doesn't exist. But we could look at Vauxhall Walk and then have a look, but I haven't done that, so I'm sorry. And now my roads are knitting, my notes are written, and I've got a timer, and so I'm probably not going to go back and do it. But there we have it, the Gothic trope, the antiquated place. Of course, this is different in America because what you get is, of course, you have the New England stories, even the Lovecraftian stories, you know, like Dreams in the Witch House, the old antiquated houses. But even if you look at Henry James and Edith Wharton, and they're doing stories in that part of the world, or the east coast, northeast coast of the USA, and they're old buildings. And then, of course, we have Faulkner and Southern Gothic, and they're the old plantation houses. But, of course, as it migrates into suburban America, we get the ordinary house, the Amityville house, you know. And so the current crop, for quite a long time, of horror ghost stories that you see is an ordinary family moving into their ordinary dream home, which is a direct descendant of the Gothic castle, but just adapted for times and places. Anyway, so it's tick, we've got that. One of the issues of Gothic is secrets, particularly family secrets. Tick, we've got that. Treasure and legacies, tick, tick, we've got that. We've got kind of eerie, weird servants, or sometimes the servants are helpful. That's a massive Gothic thing. This lad is caught by an old servant, so he fulfills that role. One of the other things of the 18th century and earlier Gothic stories is sometimes there were like peasants or people down at heel who were the protagonists, but they generally turned out to be nobles. You know, it's almost like they, you know, I think certainly in British literature of that period there's a big divide, and still is, between the working class, the chavs of today, and the middle class. And the middle class tend to read and write books, and they are, I always think it's something like the Spartans in lots of ways. The Spartans had their slaves, the helots, who did all the work for them, and they were terrified of them in case they rose up, and they didn't really like them, and they were frightened of them. You know, fear breeds dislike and hatred, and so very often this is what you see, that the protagonists can't be working class because they're not. Now, in the Victorian period and later into the mid 20th century, when working class writers come out, you see them as protagonists. But I think something about Riddell, which is really, even somebody like M.R. James, writing later than this, a generation later than this, his working class people tend to be comic. They don't tend to be wicked, but they tend to be comic turns, if you like. They come on to impart information, and they're slightly laughable, really. In this, in Riddell, throughout her work, they're not. She just portrays them as ordinary people. I think the servant in this, whose name I forget, that surely is significant. He's a decent bloke, isn't he? And he's not portrayed as comic. He's not written in a Warrior accent or a Cockney accent like the orcs in Lord of the Rings, which is another example of this. So Riddell is very sympathetic towards ordinary people, ordinary working people, as our current politicians keep calling them. Right, so Yeah, so the servants, that was a bit of a digression from the idea of the Gothic trope of the servants. And also another thing is isolation. Of course, you put your, and this is a classic thing if you want a ghost story to work, if you want to write a ghost story that works, isolate your protagonist, and of course there he is in this house, this spooky house all on his own. And then related to those Gothic tropes, but like a subset, is the role of the ghost. The ghost doesn't appear in the Gothic. The ghost goes back to the Bible, doesn't it? And probably before. The supernatural stories go way back. But the role of the ghost in society, and the role of stories in general, was thought to be... one of the criticisms of the Gothic was that it wasn't sufficiently educational, that it was there for sensation and spectacle rather than edifying the public. Whereas one of the roles of the ghost is to help the story tell people how we should behave morally to each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. So what we got is several roles in this story commonly found in ghosts. First of all, the spirit of unfinished business. She is bound to the house due to her miserly behaviour in life. And that is a classic of the earthbound spirit. They're not free to go until their sins are paid for. So unresolved issues, that's the other thing. A symbol of guilt. She has a remorse over her miserliness, pretty much like Jacob Marley. I'm going to probably say something about Dickens in a minute. She didn't help anybody, including her own family members, and the second female ghost is probably Sarah, her niece, and the male ghost is maybe Tynan himself, that's who I thought it was. So the apparition then, her is like Marley, is to let Tynan himself know about the dangers of greed and the importance of generosity. That's it. There are two themes to this story, I think, and I think it would have been better, if you don't mind me saying, if she'd only had one. It would have been clearer. So don't be miserly, live with the living. What's your money for? Help people. There's a lot of suffering in the world. Help people. This is a really Victorian Christian view as well. And also, the ghost can be interpreted as a form of psychological projection, and people can talk about Gothic ghosts like this, as anxieties about wealth and morality. So it was a very divided society, with the rich being extremely rich and the poor being utterly miserable and living in dreadful conditions, as if you read Engels' Conditions of the English Working Class. I must admit I haven't read the whole book. But, it's bad. And we know that. We've read our Dickens, haven't we? We know about all of the twist. We know about all of that. There is one plot hole that moved on from the function of the ghost to a plot hole that I see. Why did the murderers come back that particular night? Did I miss something? Did they become aware of, or did Tynan, this is what I first thought, Tynan had tipped them off that the lad was searching, Graham Coulton was searching for the treasure and may have found it. So that made me think, Tynan was behind the murder, the Mr. Tynan, the landlord, not Miss Tynan, his aunt. I don't know. So, I thought that was a plot hole. The other thing I was going to say, the second theme. So the first theme is about the dangers of miserliness. The second theme is about familial duty, I think, and how members of a family have a duty to them. And this is another Victorian idea, and probably not just Victorian, but a widely spread idea that was prominent in Victorian times. So you have a duty to your family members. My step-grandfather, who I never met, had two unmarried sisters, and he made provision for them so that they would have money, and then he died, they inherited, and they're both married. So there we are. That's just one of those things, isn't it? Their husbands then kept them. I keep knocking this pop screen. Okay, so the familial duties, and of course this reminds Graham Coulton that he should make up with his father, because honour thy father and thy mother. And this is what the servant keeps telling him. So I think those two themes run alongside. Yeah, and I suppose they are sort of linked, because it's her miserliness, Miss Tynan's miserliness, that stops her helping her kin, which is the great crime, I think. let's talk about, so redemption is an interesting thing, and at the end Admiral Coulton is willing to listen to Graham's story and forgive his son. So he has had this very rigid, judgmental stance. Okay, another theme then potentially is cowardice. If you remember, the man mustn't be a coward, and this is the Admiral. Imagine him as a warrior, if you like. His son is accused of being a coward. There's also some subtext about the father being awful to the mother, and at the end, the servant tells Graham Coulton the proper story and puts it in perspective, so that Graham Coulton is willing to listen to his father, Admiral Coulton's, and not just blame him for that. There's two sides to every story. But so cowardice and his staying in the haunted house. Even the servant feels that the lad Graham doesn't have the mettle to stay in a haunted house, but he proves him wrong. He is no coward. And after he's proved that, after that's proven, he can go back to his father and they can make up and live in the proper relationship of a father and son, as would be stipulated by society at that time. Now, you've got to realise, if you're listening to me say these things, this is not necessarily my view, because I know people get themselves all upset about these things and then they send me comments, some of which are not politely worded. And I just still eat them though. But the fact that these stories after so much time can work you up, if you are worked up, either frighten you or make you exercised about these issues, shows the power in the writing, and that is what stories are for. If the story doesn't do anything like that, then you're just going to walk away and peel potatoes, aren't you? Because it doesn't mean anything to you. So if the story still does that, then it's still working, and I think that's an accolade to her. I think she's a very accomplished writer. Clearly this is a woman who wrote 40 novels. She knows what she's doing, and she puts in the things that her Victoria, and this is the other kind of subtext, is not necessarily do I believe the things that she's reinforcing in the story, the moral obligations that she's reinforced. Don't be a miser. Of course, being a miser is great in my book. Be kind and look after your family. No, in my book, no. Just tell them where to go. I'm joking, obviously. But she doesn't necessarily believe that either. She knows what her audience is going to lap up. She's a professional. And so, she may have thought that was all nonsense, all of those things, but that's the story because that's what people want to read, So I don't know, she maybe did believe that either. I'm not saying she isn't inauthentic, but you can't presume a writer means something just cause they say it. Let's think so redemption and miserliness. Clearly we're thinking of Charles Dickens, we're thinking of A Christmas Carol. But, manifestation is really important. So this is a narrative device, the same narrative device. We've got Scrooge, haven't we? Same story. Clearly not the same story, but same ideas. So we have the portrayal of poverty and people being down and out in Victorian London, and then we have redemption. So Riddell, these are my notes, story adopts a more matter-of-fact tone, particularly in its treatment of the supernatural elements. The narrative voice maintains a certain detachment even when describing ghostly encounters. This contrasts with Dickens' often more emotive and sentimental approach. He was a very sentimental writer, to be honest, to depicting the struggles of the poor. Listen, I read Dickens with the chimes and stuff, and I cry at the terrible injustice that's visited upon the poor, in his stories. Both authors address the themes of social inequality and the potential for redemption. Riddell's story, in this case, focuses more on the consequences of greed than and the supernatural manifestations of guilt. Although she is a cautionary figure, he's more overtly sentimental in a big style. But, Dickens, this is a big theme in Dickens' work, whereas I think it's just a particular one in Riddell's work here. So, redemption was a big deal in Victorian fiction. So we talk about Christmas Carol, but also Great Expectations, where Pip's moral education and eventual redemption through humility and hard work reflects the Victorian emphasis on self-improvement and moral rectitude. And we look at George Eliot, such as Silas Marner, explore redemption through the healing power of human relationships and community, and the protagonist's transformation from a bitter recluse to a loving father. Illustrates the Victorian belief, again, in the redemptive power of love and social connection. Thomas Hardy, often bleaker still grapple with the concept of redemption, though often in a more complex and ambiguous manner. In Tessa de d'Urberville's The Question of Whether Tess Can Be Redeemed from Her Fallen State challenges Victorian moral conventions and highlights the often harsh and unforgiving nature of society's judgment. So we have to remember that, Victorian society was brutal if you did not fit in or overstepped. So we're given these moral injunctions. It's not just, in Victorian society, it wasn't just, honour thy father and mother, do all these things. It's like, you better had, or else, we will kick you out. And then we've got Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth directly confronts the possibility of redemption for a fallen woman. So slightly different kind of redemption, but it's the same kind of thing. And I wanted to leave you, I like to throw curveballs, as I say, in baseball, I believe. So let's think about, we'll just throw this one in. So Henri Bergson was a French philosopher, and he said some very interesting things about the time. So he had this concept of duration. So basically what he said was, mathematicians and physicians and all you people, you divide time into past, present and future. But that is not our experience. Our experience is, it just goes on. We don't divide into past, present and future. Our experience is there is no division. And he called this durée, duration. So let's have a look at this. And he says that time is not, Bergson is not a series of discrete moments, but rather a continuous flow of experience. I just said that. In Riddell's story, the haunted house serves as a space where past and present coexist, aligning with Bergson's idea that the past is not gone, but continually interpenetrates the present. This is, again, a French, Jacques Derrida's hauntology, the past is haunted by the present, the future is haunted by the past. Everything haunts everything. That's all you've got to remember with hauntology. It's just everything is haunting everything. And so, yeah, she's dead, but she's still there. You see what I'm saying? If she was dead and gone, and there was a past and it was all gone, it wouldn't be relevant. But it's still relevant because the past is relevant to the future. And so in this house, which I like the idea of it, past and present interpenetrate. Yeah, there we are. So he has other theories on memory and consciousness. So memory is not just a record of past events, but an active force shaping our present consciousness. And I think that modern laboratory psychology has proved this, whereby if you can influence people's memories, you can implant memories, you can change their memories. For example, I remember when I was doing psychology, this experiment whereby you say, so tell me about how the white car smashed into the red car, and they tell you a story that involves smashing, and then you go, tell me the story about how the white car bumped the red car, and they tell you their memory then is of it not being quite as violent, and so the past is not a record; it is shaped by the present. Yeah. So Graham Coulton's experiences in the house are influenced by the lingering memories and actions of its former inhabitants. Now that is a very spooky idea, isn't it? That Ian McGilchrist, I was reading him recently. Our feelings, we think our feelings and our thoughts are situated in ourselves. We think, I have a thought about this, I have a feeling about this. But they go beyond, particularly our feelings, they go beyond our boundaries. You think of love, hate, they involve just not you. They go between people. And so, certainly, your feelings are influenced by the feelings of those around you. And this interesting idea is that, and I love this idea, the haunting is the emotion of people who've been there, which still affects you, and not just in a sense of feelings, but I suppose what we're saying, the idea of a haunting, that is, we talked about stone tape theory, haven't we, in the past, which is about how there was this quasi-scientific theory, I don't think it stands up, that strong emotional things happening in a building somehow are recorded in the quartz crystals in the stone, and then like a videotape or an audio tape, some kind of tape, and stone tape, get it, and then replay back again. But that is the haunting idea, that, and even without the stone tape theory, that if a murder is committed in the house in some way, that feeling will persist. And that is the haunting. So that we may be saying that in Bergson. I'm not sure he did say this, but my interpretation of Bergson in this context, so the feelings of whatever happened in the house affect us. But ghost stories go a bit further, and they have a moral dimension. Not only do we just feel something, that feeling has a moral message and informs how we should behave. It becomes an ought, doesn't it? So terrible things happened in this house in Vauxhall Walk due to this woman's miserliness and not caring for her family. So you, Graham Coulton, don't be a miser and care for people. And so, the haunting has a moral thing. So anyway, just throwing all those stuff around. And this is what you come here for anyway, isn't it, really? So you can be ironing and I'll say something stupid and you can disagree with it. And I've got to say, yeah, I don't have the answers. These are just thoughts. And you are very, very welcome to disagree with them. But I suppose the issue is, in a polite society, you may teach me something I don't know when you disagree with me, and I may teach you something you don't know, but we can do that in a civilized, agreeable manner, and we don't have to be like this current age of outrage fueled by social media. And I said before, Mike Tyson famously says, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And I've said this before in other things, politeness is always backed up by the threat of violence, really. So if you were too rude to me in my presence, I might smack you in the mouth, and so that informs your politeness. Whereas I'm saying yours, not yours, you wouldn't do that. Let's say these keyboard warriors on Twitter and some of them who write in YouTube comments, they wouldn't say that to the person themselves. They would not say it. It's like people in their cars are a lot braver with their fingers and all this than in real life, and when the car stops, that's when they regret their rudeness. So this is a long diatribe, but basically I think we can be polite to each other, can't we? Even people we disagree with, even people we vehemently disagree with, we can offer them the courtesy of non-violence, either verbal or physical. There you go, there's my own moral message. For what it's worth. And it might not be a lot. The Dreams in the Witch House by H.P. Lovecraft. Whether the dreams brought on the fever, or the fever brought on the dreams, Walter Gilman did not know. Behind everything crouched the brooding, festering horror of the ancient town, and of the mouldy, unhallowed garret gable, where he wrote and studied and wrestled with figures and formulae when he was not tossing on the meagre iron bed. His ears were growing sensitive to a preternatural and intolerable degree, and he had long ago stopped the cheap mantel clock, whose ticking had come to seem like a thunder of artillery. At night, the subtle stirring of the black city outside, the sinister scurrying of rats in the wormy partitions, and the creaking of hidden timbers in the centuried house were enough to give him a sense of strident pandemonium. The darkness always teemed with unexplained sound, and yet he sometimes shook with fear lest the noises he heard should subside and allow him to hear certain other, fainter noises which he suspected were lurking behind them. He was in the changeless, legend-haunted city of Arkham, with its clustering gambrel roofs that sway and sag over attics where witches hid from the king's men in the dark olden days of the province. Nor was any spot in that city more steeped in macabre memory than the gable room which harboured him, for it was this house and this room which had likewise harboured old Keziah Mason, whose flight from Salem jail at the last no one was ever able to explain. That was in 1692. The jailer had gone mad and babbled of a small, white-fanged, furry thing which scuttled out of Keziah's cell, and not even Cotton Mather could explain the curves and angles smeared on the grey stone walls with some red, sticky fluid. Possibly Gilman ought not to have studied so hard. Non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics are enough to stretch any brain, and when one mixes them with folklore and tries to trace a strange background of multi-dimensional reality behind the ghoulish hints of the Gothic tales and the wild whispers of the chimney corner, one can hardly expect to be wholly free from mental tension. Gilman came from Haverhill, but it was only after he had entered college in Arkham that he began to connect his mathematics with the fantastic legends of elder magic. Something in the air of the hoary town worked obscurely on his imagination. The professors at Miskatonic had urged him to slacken up and had voluntarily cut down his course at several points. Moreover, they had stopped him from consulting the dubious old books on forbidden secrets that were kept under lock and key in a vault at the university library. But all these precautions came late in the day, so that Gilman had some terrible hints from the dreaded Necronomicon of Abdul al-Hazred, the fragmentary Book of Eibon, and the suppressed Unaussprachlichen Kulten of von Junz to correlate with his abstract formulae on the properties of space and the linkage of dimensions, known and unknown. He knew his room was in the old witch house. That indeed was why he had taken it. There was much in the Essex County records about Keziah Mason's trial, and what she had admitted under pressure to the court of Oyer and Terminer had fascinated Gilman beyond all reason. She had told Judge Haythorne of lines and curves that could be made to point out directions leading through the walls of space to other spaces beyond, and had implied that such lines and curves were frequently used at certain midnight meetings in the dark valley of the White Stone beyond Meadow Hill and on the unpeopled island in the river. She had spoken also of the Black Man, of her oath, and of her new secret name of Nahab. Then she had drawn these devices on the walls of her cell and vanished. Gilman believed strange things about Keziah and had felt a queer thrill on learning that her dwelling was still standing after more than 235 years. When he heard the hushed Arkham whispers about Keziah's persistent presence in the old house in the narrow streets, about the irregular human tooth marks left on certain sleepers in that and other houses, about the childish cries heard near May Eve and Hallowmass, about the stench often noted in the old house's attic just after those dreaded seasons, and about the small, furry, sharp-toothed thing which haunted the mouldering structure and the town and nuzzled people curiously in the black hours before dawn. He resolved to live in the place at any cost. A room was easy to secure, for the house was unpopular, hard to rent, and long given over to cheap lodgings. Gilman could not have told what he expected to find there, but he knew he wanted to be in the building where some circumstance had more or less suddenly given a mediocre old woman of the 17th century an insight into mathematical depths perhaps beyond the utmost modern delvings of Planck, Heisenberg, Einstein, and de Sitter. He studied the timber and plaster walls for traces of cryptic designs at every accessible spot where the paper had peeled, and within a week managed to get the eastern attic room where Keziah was held to have practiced her spells. It had been vacant from the first, for no one had ever been willing to stay there long. But the Polish landlord had grown wary about renting it. Yet nothing whatever happened to Gilman, till about the time of the fever. No ghostly Keziah flitted through the somber halls and chambers. No small furry thing crept into his dismal eyrie to nuzzle him, and no record of the witch's incantations rewarded his constant search. Sometimes he would take walks through shadowy tangles of unpaved, musty-smelling lanes where eldritch brown houses of unknown age leaned and tottered and leered mockingly through narrow, small-paned windows. Here he knew strange things had happened once, and there was a faint suggestion behind the surface that everything of that monstrous past might not, at least in the darkest, narrowest and most intricately crooked alleys, have utterly perished. He also rowed out twice to the ill-regarded island in the river and made a sketch of the singular angles described by the moss-grown rows of grey standing stones whose origin was so obscure and immemorial. Gilman's room was of good size, but queerly irregular shape, the north wall slanting perceptibly inward from the outer to the inner end, while the low ceiling slanted gently downwards in the same direction. Aside from an obvious rat hole and the signs of other stopped-up ones, there was no access, nor any appearance of a former avenue of access to the space, which must have existed between the slanting wall and the straight outer wall on the house's northern side, though a view from the exterior showed where a window had been boarded up at a very remote date. The loft above the ceiling, which must have had a slanting floor, was likewise inaccessible. When Gilman climbed up a ladder to the cobwebbed level loft above the rest of the attic, he found vestiges of a bygone aperture tightly and heavily covered with ancient planking and secured by the stout wooden pegs common in colonial carpentry. No amount of persuasion, however, could induce the stolid landlord to let him investigate either of those two closed spaces. As time wore on, his absorption in the irregular wall and ceiling of his room increased, for he began to read into the odd angles a mathematical significance which seemed to offer vague clues regarding their purpose. Old Keziah, he reflected, might have had excellent reasons for living in a room with peculiar angles, for was it not through certain angles that she claimed to have gone outside the boundaries of the world of space we know? His interest gradually veered away from the unplumbed voids beyond the slanting surfaces, since it now appeared that the purpose of those surfaces concerned the side he was already on. The touch of brain fever and the dreams began early in February. For some time, apparently, the curious angles of Gilman's room had been having a strange, almost hypnotic effect on him. And as the bleak winter advanced, he had found himself staring more and more intently at the corner where the down-slanting ceiling met the inward slanting wall. About this period, his inability to concentrate on his formal studies worried him considerably. His apprehensions about the mid-year examinations being very acute, but the exaggerated sense of hearing was scarcely less annoying. Life had become an insistent and almost unendurable cacophony, and there was that constant, terrifying impression of other sounds, perhaps from regions beyond life, trembling on the very brink of audibility. So far as concrete noises went, the rats in the ancient partitions were the worst. Sometimes their scratching seemed not only furtive, but deliberate. When it came from beyond the slanting north wall, it was mixed with a sort of dry rattling. And when it came from the century-closed loft above the slanting ceiling, Gilman always braced himself as if expecting some horror which only bided its time before descending to engulf him utterly. The dreams were wholly beyond the pale of sanity, and Gilman felt they must be a result jointly of his studies in mathematics and in folklore. He had been thinking too much about the vague regions which his formulae told him must lie beyond the 3 dimensions we know, and about the possibility that old Keziah Mason, guided by some influence past all conjecture, had actually found the gate to those regions. The yellowed county records containing her testimony and that of her accusers were so damnably suggestive of things beyond human experience, and the descriptions of the darting little furry object which served as her familiar were so painfully realistic despite their incredible details. That object, no larger than a good-sized rat and quaintly called by the townspeople Brown Jenkin, seemed to have been the fruit of a remarkable case of sympathetic herd delusion, for in 1692 no less than 11 persons had testified to glimpsing it. There were recent rumours too, with a baffling and disconcerting amount of agreement. Witnesses said it had long hair and the shape of a rat, but that its sharp-toothed, bearded face was evilly human, while its paws were like tiny human hands. It took messages betwixt old Keziah and the devil, and was nursed on the witch's blood which it sucked like a vampire. Its voice was a kind of loathsome titter, and it could speak all languages. Of all the bizarre monstrosities in Gilman's dreams, nothing filled him with greater panic and nausea than this blasphemous and diminutive hybrid, whose image fitted across his vision in a form 1,000-fold more hateful than anything his waking mind had deduced from the ancient records and the modern whispers. Gilman's dreams consisted largely in plunges through limitless abysses of inexplicably coloured twilight and bafflingly disordered sound. Abysses whose material and gravitational properties and whose relation to his own entity he could not even begin to explain. He did not walk or climb, fly or swim, crawl or wriggle, yet always experienced a mode of motion partly voluntary and partly involuntary. Of his own condition he could not well judge, for sight of his arms, legs and torso seemed always cut off by some odd disarrangement of perspective. But he felt that his physical organization and faculties were somehow marvelously transmuted and obliquely projected, though not without a certain grotesque relationship to his normal proportions and properties. The abysses were by no means vacant, being crowded with indescribably angled masses of alien-hued substance, some of which appeared to be organic, while others seemed inorganic. A few of the organic objects tended to awake vague memories in the back of his mind, though he could form no conscious idea of what they mockingly resembled or suggested. In the later dreams, he began to distinguish separate categories into which the organic objects appeared to be divided, and which seemed to involve, in each case, a radically different species of conduct pattern and basic motivation. Of these categories, one seemed to him to include objects slightly less illogical and irrelevant in their motions than the members of the other categories. All the objects, organic and inorganic alike, were totally beyond description or even comprehension. Gilman sometimes compared the inorganic masses to prisms, labyrinths, clusters of cubes and planes, and cyclopean buildings, and the organic things struck him variously as groups of bubbles, octopi, centipedes, living Hindu idols, and intricate arabesques roused into a kind of Ophidian animation. Everything he saw was unspeakably menacing and horrible. And whenever one of the organic entities appeared by its motions to be noticing him, he felt a stark, hideous fright which generally jolted him awake. Of how the organic entities moved, he could tell no more than of how he moved himself. In time, he observed a further mystery, the tendency of certain entities to appear suddenly out of empty space, or to disappear totally with equal suddenness. The shrieking, roaring confusion of sound which permeated the abysses was past all analysis as to pitch, timbre, or rhythm, but seemed to be synchronous with vague visual changes in all the indefinite objects, organic and inorganic alike. Gilman had a constant sense of dread that it might rise to some unbearable degree of intensity during one or other of its obscure, relentlessly inevitable fluctuations. But it was not in these vortices of complete alienage that he saw Brown Jenkin. That shocking little horror was reserved for certain lighter, sharper dreams which assailed him just before he dropped into the fullest depths of sleep. He would be lying in the dark, fighting to keep awake, when a faint lambent glow would seem to shimmer around the centuried room, showing in a violet mist the convergence of angled planes which had seized his brain so insidiously. The horror would appear to pop out of the rat hole in the corner and patter toward him over the sagging white planked floor with evil expectancy in its tiny bearded human face. But mercifully, this dream always melted away before the object got close enough to nuzzle him. It had hellishly long, sharp canine teeth. Gilman tried to stop up the rat hole every day, but each night the real tenants of the partitions would gnaw away the obstruction, whatever it might be. Once he had the landlord nail tin over it, but the next night the rats gnawed a fresh hole, in making which they pushed or dragged out into the room a curious little fragment of bone. Gilman did not report his fever to the doctor, for he knew he could not pass the examinations if ordered to the college infirmary, when every moment was needed for cramming. As it was, he failed in Calculus D and Advanced General Psychology, though not without hope of making up lost ground before the end of the term. It was March when the fresh element entered his lighter preliminary dreaming, and the nightmare shape of Brown Jenkin began to be companioned by the nebulous blur which grew more and more to resemble a bent old woman. This addition disturbed him more than he could account for, but finally he decided that it was like an ancient crone whom he had twice actually encountered in the dark tangle of lanes near the abandoned wharves. On those occasions, the evil, sardonic, and seemingly unmotivated stare of the beldam had set him almost shivering, especially the first time, when an overgrown rat darting across the shadowed mouth of a neighbouring alley had made him think irrationally of Brown Jenkin. Now, he reflected, those nervous fears were being mirrored in his disordered dreams. That the influence of the old house was unwholesome, he could not deny, but traces of his early morbid interest still held him there. He argued that the fever alone was responsible for his nightly fantasies, and that when the touch abated, he would be free from the monstrous visions. Those visions, however, were of abhorrent vividness and convincingness, and whenever he awakened, he retained a vague sense of having undergone much more than he remembered. He was hideously sure that in unrecalled dreams he had talked with both Brown Jenkin and the old woman, and that they had been urging him to go somewhere with them, and to meet a third being of greater potency. Toward the end of March, he began to pick up in his mathematics, though other studies bothered him increasingly. He was getting an intuitive knack for solving Riemannian equations, and astonished Professor Upham by his comprehension of fourth-dimensional and other problems which had floored all the rest of the class. One afternoon, there was a discussion of possible freakish curvatures in space, and of theoretical points of approach or even contact between our part of the cosmos and various other regions as distant as the farthest stars or the transatlantic gulfs themselves, or even as fabulously remote as the tentatively conceivable cosmic units beyond the whole Einsteinian space-time continuum. Gilman's handling of this theme filled everyone with admiration, even though some of his hypothetical illustrations caused an increase in the always plentiful gossip about his nervous and solitary eccentricity. What made the students shake their heads was his sober theory that a man might, given mathematical knowledge admittedly beyond all likelihood of human acquirement, step deliberately from the earth to any other celestial body which might lie at one of an infinity of specific points in the cosmic pattern. Such a step, he said, would require only two stages. First, a passage out of the three-dimensional sphere we know, and second, a passage back to the three-dimensional sphere at another point, perhaps one of infinite remoteness. That this could be accomplished without any loss of life was in many cases conceivable. Any being from any part of three-dimensional space could probably survive in the fourth dimension, and its survival of the second stage would depend upon what alien part of three-dimensional space it might select for its re-entry. Denizens of some planets might be able to live on certain others, even planets belonging to other galaxies or to similar dimensional phases of other space-time continua, though of course there must be vast numbers of mutually uninhabitable, even though mathematically juxtaposed bodies or zones of space. It was also possible that the inhabitants of a given dimensional realm could survive entry to many unknown and incomprehensible realms of additional or indefinably multiplied dimensions, be they within or outside the given space-time continuum, and that the converse would likewise be true. This was a matter for speculation, though one could be fairly certain that the type of mutation involved in the passage from any given dimensional plane to the next higher plane would not be destructive of biological integrity as we understand it. Gilman could not be very clear about his reasons for this last assumption, but his haziness here was more than overbalanced by his clearness on other complex points. Professor Upham especially liked his demonstration of the kinship of higher mathematics to certain phases of magical lore, transmitted down the ages from an ineffable antiquity, human or pre-human, whose knowledge of the cosmos and its laws was greater than ours. Around the 1st of April, Gilman worried considerably because his slow fever did not abate. He was also troubled by what some of his fellow lodgers said about his sleepwalking. It seemed that he was often absent from his bed, and that the creaking of his floor at certain hours of the night was remarked by the man in the room below. This fellow also spoke of hearing the tread of shod feet in the night, but Gilman was sure he must be mistaken in this, since shoes as well as other apparel were always precisely in place in the morning. One could develop all sorts of oral delusions in this morbid old house, for did not Gilman himself, even in daylight, now feel certain that noises other than rat scratchings came from the black voids beyond the slanting wall and above the slanting ceiling? His pathologically sensitive ears began to listen for faint footfalls in the immemorially sealed loft overhead, and sometimes the illusion of such things was agonizingly realistic. However, he knew that he had actually become a somnambulist, for twice at night his room had been found vacant, though with all his clothing in place. Of this he had been assured by Frank Elwood, the one fellow student whose poverty forced him to room in this squalid and unpopular house. Elwood had been studying in the small hours and had come up for help on a differential equation, only to find Gilman absent. It had been rather presumptuous of him to open the unlocked door after knocking had failed to rouse a response, but he had needed the help very badly and thought that his host would not mind a gentle prodding awake. On neither occasion, though, had Gilman been there, and when told of the matter, he wondered where he could have been wandering, barefoot and with only his night clothes on. He resolved to investigate the matter if reports of his sleepwalking continued, and thought of sprinkling flour on the floor of the corridor to see where his footsteps might lead. The door was the only conceivable egress, but there was no possible foothold outside the narrow window. As April advanced, Gilman's fever-sharpened ears were disturbed by the whining prayers of a superstitious loom fixer named Joe Mazurovich, who had a room on the ground floor. Mazurovich had told long, rambling stories about the ghost of old Keziah and the furry, sharp-fanged, nuzzling thing, and had said he was so badly haunted at times that only his silver crucifix, given him for the purpose by Father Ivanicki of St. Stanislaus's church, could bring him relief. Now he was praying because the witch's Sabbath was drawing near. May Eve was Walpurgisnacht, when hell's blackest evil roamed the earth, and all the slaves of Satan gathered for nameless rites and deeds. It was always a very bad time in Arkham, even though the fine folks up in the Miskatonic Avenue and high in Saltonstall streets pretended to know nothing about it. There would be bad doings, and a child or two would probably be missing. Joe knew about such things, for his grandmother in the old country had heard tales from her grandmother. It was wise to pray and count one's beads at this season. For 3 months, Keziah and Brown Jenkin had not been near Joe's room, nor near Paul Choinsky's room, nor anywhere else, and it meant no good when they left off like that. They must be up to something. Gilman dropped in at the doctor's office on the 16th of the month, and was surprised to find his temperature was not as high as he had feared. The physician questioned him sharply and advised him to see a nerve specialist. On reflection, he was glad he had not consulted the still more inquisitive college doctor, old Waldron, who had curtailed his activities before and would have made him take a rest, an impossible thing now that he was so close to great results in his equations. He was certainly near the boundary between the known universe and the fourth dimension, and who could say how much farther he might go? But even as these thoughts came to him, he wondered at the source of his strange confidence. Did all of this perilous sense of imminence come from the formulae on the sheets he covered day by day? The soft, stealthy, imaginary footsteps in the sealed loft above were unnerving. And now, too, there was a growing feeling that somebody was constantly persuading him to do something terrible which he could not do. How about the somnambulism? Where did he sometimes go in the night? And what was that faint suggestion of sound which once in a while seemed to trickle through the maddening confusion of identifiable sounds, even in broad daylight and full wakefulness? Its rhythm did not correspond to anything on earth, unless, perhaps, to the cadence of 1 or 2 unmentionable Sabbath chants, and sometimes he feared it corresponded to certain attributes of the vague shrieking or roaring in whose holy alien abysses of dream. The dreams were meanwhile getting to be atrocious. In the lighter preliminary phase, the evil old woman was now of fiendish distinctness, and Gilman knew she was the one who had frightened him in the slums. Her bent back, long nose and shriveled chin were unmistakable, and her shapeless brown garments were like those he remembered. The expression on her face was one of hideous malevolence and exultation, and when he awakened he could recall a croaking voice that persuaded and threatened. He must meet the black man and go with them all to the throne of Azathoth, at the center of ultimate chaos. That was what she said. He must sign in his own blood the book of Azathoth and take a new secret name now that his independent delvings had gone so far. What kept him from going with her and Brown Jenkin and the other to the throne of chaos where the thin flutes pipe mindlessly was the fact that he had seen the name Azathoth in the Necronomicon and knew it stood for a primal evil too horrible for description. The old woman always appeared out of thin air near the corner where the downward slant met the inward slant. She seemed to crystallize at a point closer to the ceiling than the floor, and every night she was a little nearer and more distinct before the dream shifted. Brown Jenkin too was always a little nearer at the last, and its yellowish-white fangs glistened shockingly in that unearthly violent phosphorescence. Its shrill, loathsome tittering stuck more and more in Gilman's head, and he could remember in the morning how it had pronounced the words Azathoth and Nyarlathotep. In the deeper dreams, everything was likewise more distinct, and Gilman felt that the twilight abysses around him were those of the fourth dimension, those organic entities whose motions seemed least fragrantly irrelevant and unmotivated were probably projections of life forms from our own planet, including human beings. What the others were in their own dimensional sphere or spheres, he dared not try to think. Two of the less irrelevantly moving things, a rather large congery of iridescent prolately spheroidal bubbles, and a very much smaller polyhedron of unknown colours and rapidly shifting surface angles, seemed to take notice of him and follow him about or float ahead as he changed position among the Titan prisms, labyrinths, cube and plane clusters and quasi-buildings, and all the while the vague shrieking and roaring waxed louder and louder, as if approaching some monstrous climax of utterably unendurable intensity. During the night of April the 19th to the 20th, the new development occurred. Gilman was half involuntarily moving about in the twilight abysses with the bubble mass and the small polyhedron floating ahead, when he noticed the peculiarly regular angles formed by the edges of some gigantic neighbouring prism clusters. In another second, he was out of the abyss and standing tremulously on a rocky hillside, bathed in intense, diffused green light. He was barefooted and in his night clothes, and when he tried to walk, discovered that he could scarcely lift his feet. A swirling vapour hid everything but the immediate sloping terrain from sight, and he shrank from the thought of the sounds that might surge out of that vapour. Then he saw the two shapes laboriously crawling toward him, the old woman and the little furry thing. The crone strained up to her knees and managed to cross her arms in a singular fashion, while Brown Jenkin pointed in a certain direction with a horribly anthropoid forepaw, which it raised with evident difficulty. Spurred by an impulse he did not originate, Gilman dragged himself forward along a course determined by the angle of the old woman's arms and the direction of the small monstrosity's paw, and before he had shuffled 3 steps, he was back in the twilight abyss. Geometrical shapes seethed around him, and he fell dizzily and interminably. At last he awoke in his bed in the crazily angled garret of the eldritch old house. He was good for nothing that morning, and stayed away from all his classes. Some unknown attraction was pulling his eyes in a seemingly irrelevant direction, for he could not help staring at a certain vacant spot on the floor. As the day advanced, the focus of his unseeing eyes changed position, and by noon he had conquered the impulse to stare at vacancy. About 2 o'clock he went out for lunch, and as he threaded the narrow lanes of the city, he found himself turning always to the southeast. Only an effort halted him at a cafeteria in Church Street, and after the meal he felt the unknown pull still more strongly. He would have to consult a nerve specialist after all, Perhaps there was a connection with his somnambulism, but meanwhile he might at least try to break the morbid spell himself. Undoubtedly, he could still manage to walk away from the pull, so with great resolution he headed against it and dragged himself deliberately north along Garrison Street. By the time he had reached the bridge over the Miskatonic, he was in a cold perspiration, and he clutched at the iron railing as he gazed upstream at the ill-regarded island whose regular lines of ancient standing stones brooded sullenly in the afternoon sunlight. Then he gave a start, for there was a clearly visible living figure on that desolate island, and a second glance told him it was certainly the strange old woman whose sinister aspect had worked itself so disastrously into his dreams. The tall grass near her was moving, too, as if some other living thing were crawling close to the ground. When the old woman began to turn toward him, he fled precipitately off the bridge and into the shelter of the town's labyrinthine waterfront alleys. Distant though the island was, he felt that a monstrous and invincible evil could flow from the sardonic stare of that bent, ancient figure in brown. The southeastward pull still held, and only with tremendous resolution could Gilman drag himself into the old house and up the rickety stairs. For hours he sat, silent and aimless, with his eyes shifting gradually westward. About 6 o'clock, his sharpened ears caught the whining prayers of Joe Mazurovich 2 floors below, and in desperation he seized his hat and walked out into the sunset golden streets, letting the now directly southward pull carry him where it might. An hour later, darkness found him in the open fields beyond Hangman's Brook, with the glimmering spring stars shining ahead. The urge to walk was gradually changing to an urge to leap mystically into space, and suddenly he realized just where the source of the pull lay. It was the sky. A definite point among the stars had a claim on him and was calling him. Apparently, it was a point somewhere between Hydra and Argo Navis, and he knew that he had been urged toward it ever since he had awakened soon after dawn. In the morning, it had been underfoot. Afternoon found it rising in the southeast, and now it was roughly south but wheeling toward the west. What was the meaning of this new thing? Was he going mad? How long would it last? Again, mustering his resolution, Gilman turned and dragged himself back to the sinister old house. Mazurovich was waiting for him at the door, and seemed both anxious and reluctant to whisper some fresh bit of superstition. It was about the witchlight Joe had been out celebrating the night before. It was Patriots' Day in Massachusetts, and had come home after midnight. Looking up at the house from outside, he had thought at first that Gilman's window was dark, but then he had seen the faint violet glow within. He wanted to warn the gentleman about that glow, but everybody in Arkham knew it was Keziah's witchlight, which played near Brown Jenkin and the ghost of the old crone herself. He had not mentioned this before, but now he must tell about it, because it meant Keziah and her long-toothed familiar were haunting the young gentleman. Sometimes he and Paul Choinsky and landlord Dombrovsky thought they saw that light seeping out of cracks in the sealed loft above the young gentleman's room, but they had all agreed not to talk about that. However, it would be better for the gentleman to take another room and get a crucifix from some good priest like Father Ivaniski. As the man rambled on, Gilman felt a nameless panic clutch at his throat. He knew that Joe must have been half drunk when he came home the night before, yet this mention of a violet light in the garret window was of frightful import. It was the lambent glow of this sort which always played about the old woman and the small furry thing in those lighter, sharper dreams which prefaced his plunge into unknown abysses, and the thought that a wakeful second person could see the dream luminance was utterly beyond sane harbourage. Yet where had the fellow got such an odd notion? Had he himself talked as well as walked around the house in his sleep? No, Joe said, he had not. But he must check up on this. Perhaps Frank Elwood could tell him something, though he hated to ask. Fever, wild dreams, somnambulism, illusions of sounds, a pull towards a point in the sky, and now a suspicion of insane sleep-talking. He must stop studying, see a nerve specialist, and take himself in hand. When he climbed to the second story, he paused at Elwood's door, but saw that the other youth was out. Reluctantly, he continued up to his garret room and sat down in the dark. His gaze was still pulled to the southwest, but he also found himself listening intently from some sound in the closed loft above, and half imagining that an evil violet light seeped down through an infinitesimal crack in the low slanting ceiling. That night, as Gilman slept, the violet light broke upon him with heightened intensity, and the old witch and small furry thing, getting closer than ever before, mocked him with inhuman squeals and devilish gestures. He was glad enough to sink into that vaguely roaring twilight abyss, though the pursuit of that iridescent bubble congeries and that kaleidoscopic little polyhedron was menacing and irritating. Then came the shift, as vast converging planes of a slippery-looking substance loomed above and below him, a shift which ended in a flash of delirium and a blaze of unknown alien light in which yellow, carmine and indigo were madly and inextricably blended. He was half lying on a high, fantastically balustraded terrace above a boundless jungle of outlandish, incredible peaks, balanced plains, domes, minarets, horizontal discs poised on pinnacles, and numberless forms of still greater wildness, some of stone and some of metal, which glittered gorgeously in the mixed, almost blistering glare from a polychromatic sky. Looking upward, he saw 3 stupendous discs of flame, each of a different hue and at a different height above an infinitely distant curving horizon of low mountains. Behind him, tiers of higher terraces towered aloft as far as he could see. The city below stretched away to the limits of vision, and he hoped that no sound would well up from it. The pavement from which he easily raised himself was of a veined, polished stone beyond his power to identify, and the tiles were cut in bizarre angled shapes, which struck him as less asymmetrical than based on some unearthly symmetry whose laws he could not comprehend. The balustrade was chest-high, delicate and fantastically wrought, while along the rail were ranged at short intervals little figures of grotesque design and exquisite workmanship. They, like the whole balustrade, seemed to be made of some sort of shining metal, whose colour could not be guessed in this chaos of mixed effulgences, and their nature utterly defied conjecture. They represented some ridged, barrel-shaped object, with thin, horizontal arms radiating spoke-like from a central ring, and with vertical knobs or bulbs projecting from the head and base of the barrel. Each of these knobs was the hub of a system of 5 long, flat, triangularly tapering arms, arranged around it like the arms of a starfish, nearly horizontal but curving slightly away from the central barrel. The base of the bottom knob was fused to the long railing with so delicate a point of contact that several figures had been broken off and were missing. The figures were about 4.5 inches in height, while the spiky arms gave them a maximum diameter of about 2.5 inches. When Gilman stood up, the tiles felt hot to his bare feet. He was wholly alone, and his first act was to walk to the balustrade and look dizzily down at the endless cyclopean city almost 2,000 feet below. As he listened, he thought a rhythmic confusion of faint musical pipings covering a wide tonal range welled up from the narrow streets beneath, and he wished he might discern the denizens of the place. The sight turned him giddy after a while. so that he would have fallen to the pavement had he not clutched instinctively at the lustrous balustrade. His right hand fell on one of the projecting figures. The touch seemed to steady him slightly. It was too much, however, for the exotic delicacy of the metalwork, and the spiky figure snapped off under his grasp. Still half dazed, he continued to clutch it as his other hand seized a vacant space on the smooth railing. But now, his oversensitive ears caught something behind him, and he looked back across the level terrace. Approaching him softly, though without apparent furtiveness, were 5 figures, 2 of which were the sinister old woman and the fanged, furry little animal. The other 3 were what sent him unconscious, for they were living entities about 8 feet high, shaped precisely like the spiky images on the balustrade, and propelling themselves by a spider-like wriggling of their lower set of starfish arms. Gilman awakened in his bed, drenched by a cold perspiration, and with a smarting sensation in his face, hands and feet. Springing to the door, he washed and dressed in frantic haste, as if it were necessary for him to get out of the house as quickly as possible. He didn't know where he wished to go, but felt that once more he would have to sacrifice his classes. The odd pull towards that spot in the sky between Hydra and Argo had abated, but another of even greater strength had taken its place. Now he felt that he must go north, infinitely north. He dreaded to cross the bridge that gave a view of the desolate island in the Miskatonic, so went over the Peabody Avenue Bridge. Very often he stumbled, for his eyes and ears were chained to an extremely lofty point in the blank blue sky. After about an hour, he got himself under better control and saw that he was far from the city. All around him stretched the bleak emptiness of salt marshes, while the narrow road ahead led to Innsmouth, that ancient half-deserted town which Arkham people were so curiously unwilling to visit. Though the northward pull had not diminished, he resisted it as he had resisted the other pull, and finally found that he could almost balance the one against the other. Plodding back to town and getting some coffee at a soda fountain, he dragged himself into the public library and browsed aimlessly among the lighter magazines. Once he met some friends who remarked how oddly sunburned he looked, but he did not tell them of his walk. At 3 o'clock, he took some lunch at a restaurant, noting meanwhile that the pull had either lessened or divided itself. After that, he killed the time at a cheap cinema show, seeing the inane performance over and over again without paying any attention to it. About 9 at night, he drifted homeward and stumbled into the ancient house. Joe Mazurovich was whining unintelligible prayers, and Gilman hastened up to his own garret chamber without pausing to see if Elwood was in. It was when he turned on the feeble electric light that the shock came. At once he saw there was something on the table which did not belong there, and a second look left no room for doubt. Lying on its side, for it could not stand up alone, was the exotic spiky figure which in his monstrous dream he had broken off the fantastic balustrade. No detail was missing. The ridged, barrel-shaped center, the thin, outward curving starfish arms spreading from those knobs, all were there. In the electric light, the color seemed to be a kind of iridescent grey veined with green, and Gilman could see amidst his horror and bewilderment that one of the knobs ended in a jagged break corresponding to its former point of attachment on the dream railing. Only his tendency towards a dazed stupor prevented him from screaming aloud. This fusion of dream and reality was too much to bear. Still dazed, he clutched the spiky thing and staggered downstairs to landlord Dombrovsky's quarters. The whining prayers of the superstitious loom fixer were still sounding through the mouldy halls, but Gilman did not mind them now. The landlord was in and greeted him pleasantly. No, he'd not seen that thing before, didn't know anything about it. But his wife had said she found a funny tin thing in one of the beds when she fixed the rooms at noon, and maybe that was it. Dombrowski called her and she waddled in. Yes, that was the thing. She'd found it in the young gentleman's bed, on the side next to the wall. It had looked very queer to her, but of course the young gentleman had lots of queer things in his room. Books and curios and pictures and markings on papers. She certainly knew nothing about it. So Gilman climbed upstairs again in a mental turmoil, convinced that he was either still dreaming or that his somnambulism had run to incredible extremes and led him to depredations in unknown places. Where had he got this outre thing? He didn't recall seeing it in any museum in Arkham. It must have been somewhere, though, and the sight of it, as he snatched it in his sleep, must have caused the odd dream picture of the balustraded terrace. Next day he would make some very guarded inquiries and perhaps see the nerve specialist. Meanwhile, he would try to keep track of his somnambulism. As he went upstairs and across the garret hall, he sprinkled about some flour which he'd borrowed, with a frank admission as to its purpose from the landlord. He had stopped at Elwood's door on the way, but had found all dark within. Entering his room, he placed the spiky thing on the table and lay down in complete mental and physical exhaustion without pausing to undress. From the closed loft above the slanting ceiling, he thought he heard a faint scratching and padding, but he was too disorganized even to mind it. That cryptical pull from the north was getting very strong again, though it seemed now to come from a lower place in the sky. In the dazzling violent light of dream, the old woman and the fanged furry thing came again, and with a greater distinctness than on any former occasion. This time they actually reached him, and he felt the crone's withered claws clutching at him. He was pulled out of bed and into empty space, and for a moment he heard a rhythmic roaring and saw the twilight amorphousness of the vague abysses seething around him. But that moment was very brief, for presently he was in a crude, windowless little space, with rough beams and planks rising to a peak just above his head, and with a curious slanting floor underfoot. Propped level on that floor were low cases full of books of every degree of antiquity and disintegration, and in the centre were a table and bench, both apparently fastened in place. Small objects of unknown shape and nature were ranged on the tops of the cases, and in the flaming violet light Gilman thought he saw a counterpart of the spiky image which had puzzled him so horribly. On the left, the floor fell abruptly away, leaving a black triangular gulf, out of which, after a second's dry rattling, there presently climbed the hateful little furry thing with the yellow fangs and bearded human face. The evilly grinning beldam still clutched him, and beyond the table stood a figure he had never seen before. A tall, lean man of dead black coloration, but without the slightest sign of negroid features, wholly devoid of either hair or beard, and wearing as his only garment a shapeless robe of some heavy black fabric. His feet were indistinguishable because of the table and bench, but he must have been shod, since there was a clicking whenever he changed position. This man did not speak, and bore no trace of expression on his small, regular features. He merely pointed to a book of prodigious size which lay open on the table, while the beldam thrust a huge grey quill into Gilman's right hand. Over everything was a pall of intensely maddening fear, and the climax was reached when the furry thing ran up the dreamer's clothing to his shoulders and then below his left arm, finally biting him sharply in the wrist just below his cuff. As the blood spurted from this wound, Gilman lapsed into a faint. He awakened on the morning of the 22nd with a pain in his left wrist and saw that his cuff was brown with dried blood. His recollections were very confused, but the scene with the black man in the unknown space stood out vividly. The rats must have bitten him as he slept, giving rise to the climax of that frightful dream. Opening the door, he saw that the flour on the corridor floor was undisturbed, apart from the huge prints of the loutish fellow who roomed at the other end of the garret. So he had not been sleepwalking this time. But something would have to be done about those rats. He would speak to the landlord about them. Again, he tried to stop up the hole at the base of the slanting wall, wedging in a candlestick which seemed of about the right size. His ears were ringing horribly, as if with the residual echoes of some horrible noise heard in dreams. As he bathed and changed clothes, he tried to recall what he had dreamed after the scene in the violently lit space, but nothing definite would crystallize in his mind. That scene itself must have corresponded to the sealed loft overhead, which had begun to attack his imagination so violently. But later impressions were faint and hazy. There were suggestions of the vague twilight abysses and of still vaster, blacker abysses beyond them, abysses in which all fixed suggestion of form were absent. He had been taken there by the bubble converies and the little polyhedron which always dogged him. But they, like himself, had changed to wisps of milky, barely luminous mist in this farther void of ultimate blackness. Something else had gone on ahead, a larger wisp which now and then condensed into nameless approximations of form, and he thought that their progress had not been in a straight line, but rather along the alien curves and spirals of some ethereal vortex which obeyed laws unknown to the physics and mathematics of any conceivable cosmos. Eventually there had been a hint of vast leaping shadows, of a monstrous half-acoustic pulsing, and of the thin, monotonous piping of an unseen flute. But that was all. Gilman decided he had picked up that last conception from what he had read in the Necronomicon about the mindless entity Azathoth, which rules all time and space from a curiously environed black throne at the center of chaos. When the blood was washed away, the wrist wound proved very slight, and Gilman puzzled over the location of the two tiny punctures. It occurred to him that there was no blood on the bedspread where he'd lain, which was very curious in view of the amount on his skin and cuff. Had he been sleepwalking within his room? Or had the rat bitten him as he sat in some chair, or paused in some less rational position? He looked in every corner for brownish drops or stains, but did not find any. He had better, he thought, sprinkle flour within the room as well as outside the door, though, after all, no further proof of his sleepwalking was needed. He knew he did walk, and the thing to do now was to stop it. He must ask Frank Elwood for help. This morning the strange pulls from space seemed lessened, though they were replaced by another sensation even more inexplicable. It was a vague, insistent impulse to fly away from his present situation, but held not a hint of the specific direction in which he wished to fly. As he picked up the strange spiky image on the table, he thought of the older northward pull, growing a trifle stronger, but even so, it was wholly overruled by the newer and more bewildering urge. He took the spiky image down to Elwood's room, steeling himself against the whines of the loom fixer which welled up from the ground floor. Elwood was in, thank heaven, and appeared to be stirring about. There was time for a little conversation before leaving for breakfast and college, so Gilman hurriedly poured forth an account of his recent dreams and fears. His host was very sympathetic and agreed that something ought to be done. He was shocked by his guest's drawn, haggard aspect and noticed the queer, abnormal-looking sunburn which others had remarked during the past week. There was not much, though, that he could say. He had not seen Gilman on any sleepwalking expedition and had no idea what the curious image could be. He had, though, heard the French-Canadian who lodged just under Gilman talking to Mazurovich one evening. They were telling each other how badly they dreaded the coming of Walpurgisnacht, now only a few days off, and were exchanging pitying comments about the poor, doomed young gentleman. Desroches, the fellow under Gilman's room, had spoken of nocturnal footsteps both shod and unshod, and of the violet light he saw one night when he had stolen fearfully up to peer through Gilman's keyhole. He had not dared to peer, he told Mazurovich, after he had glimpsed that light through the cracks around the door. There had been soft talking too, and as he began to describe it, his voice had sunk to an inaudible whisper. Elwood could not imagine what had set these superstitious creatures gossiping, but supposed their imaginations had been roused by Gilman's late hours and somnolent walking and talking on the one hand, and by the nearness of the traditionally feared May Eve on the other. That Gilman talked in his sleep was plain, and it was obviously from Desroches' keyhole listenings that the delusive notion of the violet dreamlight got abroad. These simple people were quick to imagine they had seen any odd thing they had heard about. As for a plan of action, Gilman had better move down to Elwood's room and avoid sleeping alone. Elwood would, if awake, rouse him whenever he began to talk or rise in his sleep. Very soon, too, he must see the specialist. Meanwhile, they would take the spiky image round the various museums and to certain professors seeking identification and stating that it had been found in a public rubbish can. Also, Dombrovsky must attend to the poisoning of those rats in the walls. Braced up by Elwood's companionship, Gilman attended classes that day. Strange urges still tugged at him, but he could sidetrack them with considerable success. During a free period, he showed the queer image to several professors, all of whom were intensely interested, though none of them could shed any light upon its nature or origin. That night, he slept on a couch which Elwood had had the landlord bring to the second-story room, and for the first time in weeks was wholly free from disquieting dreams. But the feverishness still hung on, and the whines of the loom fixer were an unnerving influence. During the next few days, Gilman enjoyed an almost perfect immunity from morbid manifestations. He had, Elwood said, showed no tendency to talk or rise in his sleep, and meanwhile the landlord was putting rat poison everywhere. The only disturbing element was the talk among the superstitious foreigners whose imaginations had become highly excited. Mazurovich was always trying to make him get a crucifix, and finally forced one upon him, which he said had been blessed by the good Father Ivaniski. Desroches, too, had something to say. In fact, he insisted that cautious steps had sounded in the now vacant room above him on the first and second night of Gilman's absence from it. Paul Choinsky thought he heard sounds in the halls and on the stairs at night, and claimed that his door had been softly tried, while Mrs. Dombrovsky vowed she had seen brown jenking for the first time since All Hallows. But such naive reports could mean very little, and Gilman let the cheap metal crucifix hang idly from a knob on his host's dresser. For 3 days, Gilman and Elwood canvassed the local museums in an effort to identify the strange, spiky image, but always without success. In every quarter, however, interest was intense, for the utter alienage of the thing was a tremendous challenge to scientific curiosity. One of the small radiating arms was broken off and subjected to chemical analysis, and the result is still talked about in college circles. Professor Ellery found platinum, iron, and tellurium in a strange alloy, but mixed with these were at least 3 other apparent elements of high atomic weight which chemistry was absolutely powerless to classify. Not only did they fail to correspond with any known element, but they did not even fit the vacant places reserved for probable elements in the periodic system. The mystery remains unsolved to this day, though the image is on exhibition at the Museum of Miskatonic University. On the morning of April 27th, a fresh rat hole appeared in the room where Gilman was a guest, but Dombrovsky tinned it up during the day. The poison was not having much effect, for scratchings and scurryings in the walls were virtually undiminished. Elwood was out late that night, and Gilman waited up for him. He did not wish to go to sleep in a room alone, especially since he thought he had glimpsed in the evening twilight the repellent old woman whose image had become so horribly transferred to his dreams. He wondered who she was and what had been near her rattling the tin can in a rubbish heap at the mouth of a squalid courtyard. The crone had seemed to notice him and leer evilly at him, though perhaps this was merely his imagination. The next day, both the youths felt very tired and knew they would sleep like logs when night came. In the evening, they drowsily discussed the mathematical studies which had so completely and perhaps harmfully engrossed Gilman, and speculated about the linkage with ancient magic and folklore, which seemed so darkly probable. They spoke of old Keziah Mason, and Elwood, agreeing that Gilman had good scientific grounds for thinking she might have stumbled on strange and significant information. The hidden cults to which these witches belonged often guarded and handed down surprising secrets from elder, forgotten aeons, and it was by no means impossible that Keziah had actually mastered the art of passing through dimensional gates. Tradition emphasizes the uselessness of material barriers in halting a witch's motions, and who can say what underlies the old tales of broomstick rides through the night? Whether a modern student could ever gain similar powers from mathematical research alone was still to be seen. Success, Gilman added, might lead to dangerous and unthinkable situations, for who could foretell the conditions pervading an adjacent but normally inaccessible dimension? On the other hand, the picturesque possibilities were enormous. Time could not exist in certain belts of space, and by entering and remaining in such a belt, one might preserve one's life and age indefinitely, never suffering organic metabolism or deterioration except for slight amounts incurred during visit to one's own or similar planes. One might, for example, pass into a timeless dimension and emerge at some remote period of the Earth's history as young as before. Whether anybody had ever managed to do this, one could hardly conjecture with any degree of authority. Old legends are hazy and ambiguous, and in historic times all attempts at crossing forbidden gaps seem complicated by strange and terrible alliances with beings and messengers from outside. There was the immemorial figure of the deputy or messenger of hidden and terrible powers, the black man of the witch cult, and the Nyarlathotep of the Necronomicon. There was, too, the baffling problem of the lesser messengers and intermediaries, the quasi-animals and queer hybrids which legend depicts as witches' familiars. As Gilman and Elwood retired, too sleepy to argue further, they heard Joe Mazurovich reel into the house half drunk and shuddered at the desperate wildness of his whining prayers. That night, Gilman saw the violet light again. In his dream, he had heard a scratching and gnawing in the partitions and thought that someone fumbled clumsily at the latch. Then he saw the old woman and the small furry thing advancing toward him over the carpeted floor. The beldame's face was alight with inhuman exultation, and the little yellow-toothed morbidity tittered mockingly as it pointed at the heavily sleeping form of Elwood on the other couch across the room. A paralysis of fear stifled all attempts to cry out. As once before, the hideous crone seized Gilman by the shoulders, yanking him out of bed and into empty space. Again, the infinitude of the shrieking twilight abysses flashed past him, but in another second he thought he was in a dark, muddy, unknown alley of fetid odours, where the rotting walls of ancient houses towered up on every hand. Ahead was the robed black man he had seen in the peaked space in the other dream, while from a lesser distance the old woman was beckoning and grimacing imperiously. Brown Jenkin was rubbing itself with a kind of affectionate playfulness round the ankles of the black man, with the deep mud largely concealed. There was a dark, open doorway to the right, to which the black man silently pointed. Into this the grimacing crone started, dragging Gilman after her by his pyjama sleeve. There were evil-smelling staircases which creaked ominously, and on which the old woman seemed to radiate a faint violet light, and finally a door leading off a landing. The crone fumbled with the latch and pushed the door open, motioning to Gilman to wait, and disappearing inside the black aperture. The youth's oversensitive ears caught a hideous strangled cry, and apparently the beldam came out of the room bearing a small senseless form, which she thrust at the dreamer as if ordering him to carry it. The sight of this form and the expression on its face broke the spell. Still too dazed to cry out, he plunged recklessly down the noisome staircase and into the mud outside, halting only when seized and choked by the waiting black man. As consciousness departed, he heard the faint, shrill tittering of the fanged, rat-like abnormality. On the morning of the 29th, Gilman awakened into a maelstrom of horror. The instant he opened his eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong. For he was back in his old garret room with the slanting wall and ceiling, sprawled on the now unmade bed. His throat was aching inexplicably, and as he struggled to a sitting posture, he saw with growing fright that his feet and pyjama bottoms were brown with caked mud. For the moment his recollections were hopelessly hazy, but he knew at least that he must have been sleepwalking. Elwood had been lost too deeply in slumber to hear and stop him. On the floor were confused muddy prints, but oddly enough they did not extend all the way to the door. The more Gilman looked at them, the more peculiar they seemed, for in addition to those he could recognize as his, there were some smaller, almost round markings, such as the legs of a chair or table might make, except that most of them tended to be divided into halves. There were also some curious muddy rat tracks leading out of a fresh hole and back into it again. Utter bewilderment and the fear of madness racked Gilman as he staggered to the door and saw that there were no muddy prints outside. The more he remembered of his hideous dream, the more terrified he felt, and it added to his desperation to hear Joe Mazurovich chanting mournfully 2 floors below. Descending to Elwood's room, he roused his still sleeping host and began telling of how he had found himself, but Elwood could form no idea of what might really have happened. Where Gilman could have been, how he got back to his room without making tracks in the hall, and how the muddy furniture-like prints came to be mixed with his in the garret chamber, were wholly beyond conjecture. Then there were those dark, livid marks on his throat, as if he tried to strangle himself. He put his hands up to them, but found that they did not even approximately fit. While they were talking, Desrochers dropped in to say that he had heard a terrific clattering overhead in the dark small hours. No, there had been no one on the stairs after midnight, though just before midnight he had heard faint footfalls in the garret and cautiously descending steps he did not like. It was, he added, a very bad time of year for Arkham. The young gentleman had better be sure to wear the crucifix Joe Mazurovich had given him. Even the daytime was not safe, for after dawn there had been strange sounds in the house, especially a thin, childish wail, hastily choked off. Gilman mechanically attended classes that morning, but was wholly unable to fix his mind on his studies. A mood of hideous apprehension and expectancy had seized him, and he seemed to be awaiting the fall of some annihilating blow. At noon, he lunched at the university spa, picking up a paper from the next seat as he waited for dessert. But he never ate that dessert, for an item on the paper's first page left him limp, wild-eyed and able only to pay his check and stagger back to Elwood's room. There had been a strange kidnapping the night before in Orm's gangway, and the 2-year-old child of a clod-like laundry worker named Anastasia Volejko had completely vanished from sight. The mother, it appeared, had feared the event for some time, but the reason she assigned for her fear was so grotesque that no one took them seriously. She had, she said, seen Brown Jenkin about the place now and then, ever since early in March, and knew from his grimaces and titterings that little Ladislas must be marked for sacrifice at the awful Sabbath on Walpurgisnacht. She had asked her neighbour, Mary Chanek, to sleep in the room and try to protect the child, but Mary had not dared. She could not tell the police, for they never believed such things. Children had been taken that way every year ever since she could remember, and her friend, Pete Stovacki, could not help because he wanted the child out of the way anyhow. But what threw Gilman into a cold perspiration was the report of a pair of revellers who had been walking past the mouth of the gangway just after midnight. They admitted they had been drunk, but both vowed they had seen a crazily dressed trio furtively entering the dark passageway. There had, they said, been a huge robed Negro, a little old woman in rags, and a young white man in his nightclothes. The old woman had been dragging the youth, while around the feet of the Negro a tame rat was rubbing and weaving in the brown mud. Gilman sat in a daze all the afternoon, and Elwood, who had meanwhile seen the papers and formed terrible conjectures from them, found him thus when he came home. This time, neither could doubt but that something hideously serious was closing in around them. Between the phantasms of nightmare and the realities of the objective world, a monstrous and unthinkable relationship was crystallizing, and only stupendous vigilance could still avert more direful developments. Gilman must see a specialist sooner or later, but not just now, when all the papers were full of this kidnapping business. Just what had really happened was maddeningly obscure, and for a moment both Gilman and Elwood exchanged whispered theories of the wildest kind. Had Gilman unconsciously succeeded better than he knew in his studies of space and its dimensions? Had he actually slipped outside our sphere to points unguessed and unimaginable? Where, if anywhere, had he been on those nights of demoniac alienage? The roaring twilight abysses, the green hillside, the blistering terrace, the pulls from the stars, the ultimate black vortex, the black man, the muddy alley and the stairs, the old witch and the fanged furry horror, the bubble congeries and the little polyhedron, the strange sunburn, the wrist wound, the unexplained image, the muddy feet, the throat marks, the tales and fears of the superstitious foreigners. What did all this mean? To what extent could the laws of sanity apply to such a case? There was no sleep for either of them that night, but next day they both cut classes and drowsed. This was April the 30th, and with the dusk would come the hellish Sabbath time, which all the foreigners and the superstitious old folk feared. Mazurovich came home at 6 o'clock and said that at the mill people were whispering that the Walpurgisnacht revels would be held in the dark ravine beyond Meadow Hill, where the old white stone stands, in a place queerly void of all plant life. Some of them had even told the police and advised them to look there for the missing Volejko child, but they didn't believe anything would be done. Joe insisted that the poor young gentleman wear his nickel-chain crucifix, and Gilman put it on and dropped it inside his shirt to humour the fellow. Late at night, the two youths sat drowsing in their chairs, lulled by the rhythmical praying of the loom fixer on the floor below. Gilman listened as he nodded, his preternaturally sharpened hearing seeming to strain for some subtle, dreaded murmur beyond the noises in the ancient house. Unwholesome recollections of things in the Necronomicon and the Black Book welled up. and he found himself swaying to infandous rhythms said to pertain to the blackest ceremonies of the Sabbath and to have an origin outside the time and space we comprehend. Presently he realized what he was listening to, the hellish chant of the celebrants in the distant Black Valley. How did he know so much about what they expected? How did he know the time when Nahab and her acolyte were due to bear the brimming bowl which would follow the black cock and the black goat? He saw that Elwood had dropped asleep and tried to call out and waken him. Something, however, closed his throat. He was not his own master. Had he signed the black man's book after all? Then his fevered, abnormal hearing caught the distant wind-borne notes. Over miles of hill and field and alley they came, but he recognized them nonetheless. The fires must be lit, and the dancers must be starting in. How could he keep himself from going? What was it that had enmeshed him? Mathematics, folklore, the house, old Keziah, Brown, Jenkin. And now he saw that there was a fresh rat hole in the wall near his couch. Above the distant chanting and the nearer praying of Joe Mazurovich came another sound, a stealthy, determined scratching in the partitions. He hoped the electric lights would not go out. Then he saw the fanged, beard little face in the rat hole, the accursed little face which he at last realized bore such a shocking, mocking resemblance to old Keziah's, and heard the faint fumbling at the door. The screaming twilight abysses flashed before him, and he felt himself helpless in the formless grasp of the iridescent bubble congeries. Ahead raced a small, kaleidoscopic polyhedron, and all through the churning void there was the heightening and acceleration of the vague tonal pattern which seemed to foreshadow some unutterable and unendurable climax. He seemed to know what was coming, the monstrous burst of Walpurgis rhythm in whose cosmic timbre would be concentrated all the primal, ultimate space-time seethings which lie behind the massed spheres of matter and sometimes break forth in measured reverberations that penetrate faintly to every layer of entity and give hideous significance throughout the worlds to certain dreaded periods. But all this vanished in a second. He was again in the cramped, violet-lit peaked space with the slanting floor, the low cases of ancient books, the bench and table, the queer objects and the triangular gulf at one side. On the table lay a small white figure, an infant boy, unclothed and unconscious, while on the other side stood the monstrous, leering old woman with a gleaming, grotesque, hafted knife in her right hand, and a queerly proportioned pale metal bowl covered with curiously chased designs and having delicate lateral handles in her left. She was intoning some croaking ritual in a language which Gilman could not understand, but which seemed like something guardedly quoted in the Necronomicon. As the scene grew clear, he saw the ancient crone bend forward and extend the empty bowl across the table, and, unable to control his own motions, he reached far forward and took it in both hands, noticing as he did so its comparative lightness. At the same moment, the disgusting form of Brown Jenkins scrambled up over the brink of the triangular black gulf on his left. The crone now motioned him to hold the bowl in a certain position, while she raised the huge, grotesque knife above the small white victim, as high as her right hand could reach. The fanged, furry thing began tittering a continuation of the unknown ritual, while the witch croaked loathsome responses. Gilman felt a gnawing, poignant abhorrence shoot through his mental and emotional paralysis, and the light metal bowl shook in his grasp. A second later, The downward motion of the knife broke the spell completely, and he dropped the bow with a resounding bell-like clangor while his hands darted out frantically to stop the monstrous deed. In an instant, he had edged up the slanting floor around the end of the table and wrenched the knife from the old woman's claws, sending it clattering over the brink of the narrow triangular gulf. In another instant, however, matters were reversed, for those murderous claws had locked themselves tightly around his own throat, while the wrinkled face was twisted with insane fury. He felt the chain of the cheap crucifix grinding into his neck, and in his peril wondered how the sight of the object itself would affect the evil creature. Her strength was altogether superhuman, but as she continued her choking, he reached feebly in his shirt and drew out the metal symbol, snapping the chain and pulling it free. At sight of the device, the witch seemed struck with panic, and her grip relaxed long enough to give Gilman a chance to break it entirely. He pulled the steel-like claws from his neck and would have dragged the beldam over the edge of the gulf had not the claws received a fresh access of strength and closed in again. This time he resolved to reply in kind, and his own hands reached out for the creature's throat. Before she saw what he was doing, he had the chain of the crucifix twisted about her neck, and a moment later he had tightened it enough to cut off her breath. During her last struggle, he felt something bite at his ankle and saw Brown Jenkin had come to her aid. With one savage kick, he sent the morbidity over the edge of the gulf and heard it whimper on some level far below. Whether he had killed the ancient crone, he did not know, but he let her rest on the floor where she had fallen. Then, as he turned away, he saw on the table a sight which nearly snapped the last thread of his reason. Brown Jenkin, tough of sinew and with 4 tiny hands of demoniac dexterity, had been busy while the witch was throttling him, and his efforts had been in vain. What he had prevented the knife from doing to the victim's chest, the yellow fangs of the furry blasphemy had done to her wrist, and the bowl, so lately on the floor, stood full beside the small lifeless body. In his dream delirium, Gilman heard the hellish alien-rhythmed chant of the Sabbath coming from an infinite distance, and knew the black man must be there. Confused memories mixed themselves with his mathematics, and he believed his subconscious mind held the angles which he needed to guide him back to the normal world. Alone and unaided for the first time, he felt sure he was in the immemorially sealed loft above his own room, but whether he could ever escape through the slanting floor or the long stopped egress he doubted greatly. Besides, would not an escape from a dream loft bring him merely into a dream house, an abnormal projection of the actual place he sought? He was wholly bewildered as to the relation betwixt dream and reality in all his experiences. The passage through the vague abysses would be frightful, for the Walpurgis rhythm would be vibrating, and at last he would have to hear that hitherto veiled cosmic pulsing which he so mortally dreaded. Even now he could detect the low, monstrous shaking, whose tempo he suspected all too well. At Sabbath time, it always mounted and reached through the worlds to summon the initiate to nameless rites. Half the chants of the Sabbath were patterned on this faintly overheard pulsing, which no earthly ear could endure in its unveiled spatial fullness. Gilman wondered, too, whether he could trust his instinct to take him back to the right part of space. How could he be sure he would not land on that green-lit hillside of a far planet, on the tessellated terrace above the city of tentacled monsters somewhere beyond the galaxy, or in the spiral black vortices of that ultimate void of chaos wherein reigns the mindless demon sultan Azathoth? Just before he made the plunge, the violet light went out and left him, in utter blackness. The old witch, old Keziah, Nahab, that must have meant her death. And mixed with the distant chant of the Sabbath and the whimpers of brown Jenkin in the gulf below, he thought he heard another and wilder whine from unknown depths. Joe Mazurovich, the prayers against the crawling chaos now turning into an inexplicably triumphant shriek, worlds of sardonic actuality impinging on vortices of febrile dream. Iya Shob Nigorath, the goat with 1,000 young. They found Gilman on the floor of his queerly angled old garret room long before dawn, for the terrible cry had brought Desrochers and Choinsky and Dombrovsky and Mazurovich at once, and had even wakened the soundly sleeping Elwood in his chair. He was alive, and with open staring eyes, but seemed largely unconscious. On his throat were the marks of murderous hands, and on his left ankle was a distressing rat bite. His clothing was badly rumpled, and Joe's crucifix was missing. Elwood trembled, afraid even to speculate on what new form his friend's sleepwalking had taken. Mazurovich seemed half-dazed because of a sign he said he had in response to his prayers, and he crossed himself frantically when the squealing and whimpering of a rat sounded from beyond the slanting partition. When the dreamer was settled on his couch in Elwood's room, they sent for Dr. Malkovsky, a local practitioner who would repeat no tales where they might prove embarrassing, and he gave Gilman 2 hypodermic injections which caused him to relax in something like natural drowsiness. During the day, the patient regained consciousness at times and whispered his newest dream disjointedly to Elwood. It was a painful process, and at its very start brought out a fresh and disconcerting fact. Gilman, whose ears had so lately possessed an abnormal sensitiveness, was now stone deaf. Dr. Malowski, summoned again in haste, told Elwood that both eardrums were ruptured, as if by the impact of some stupendous sound, intense beyond all human conception or endurance. How such a sound could have been heard in the last few hours without arousing all the Miskatonic Valley was more than the honest physician could say. Elwood wrote his part of the colloquy on paper so that a fairly easy communication was maintained. Neither knew what to make of the whole chaotic business, and decided it would be better if they thought as little as possible about it. Both, though, agreed that they must leave this ancient and accursed house as soon as it could be arranged. Evening papers spoke of a police raid on some curious revelers in a ravine beyond Meadow Hill just before dawn, and mentioned that the white stone there was an object of age-long superstitious regard. Nobody had been caught, but among the scattering fugitives had been glimpsed a huge Negro. In another column it was stated that no trace of the missing child Ladislav Voleko had been found. The crowning horror came that very night. Elwood will never forget it, and was forced to stay out of college the rest of the term because of the resulting nervous breakdown. He had thought he heard rats in the partitions all the evening, but paid little attention to them. Then, long after both he and Gilman had retired, the atrocious shrieking began. Elwood jumped up, turned on the lights and rushed over to his guest's couch. The occupant was emitting sounds of veritably inhuman nature, as if racked by some torment beyond description. He was writhing under the bedclothes, and a great red stain was beginning to appear on the blankets. Elwood scarcely dared to touch him, but gradually the screaming and writhing subsided. By this time, Dombrovsky, Choinsky, Desrochers, Mazurovich, and the top-floor lodger were all crowding into the doorway, and the landlord had sent his wife back to telephone for Dr. Malkovsky. Everybody shrieked when a large rat-like form suddenly jumped out from beneath the ensanguined bedclothes and scuttled across the floor to a fresh open hole close by. When the doctor arrived and began to pull down those frightful covers, Walter Gilman was dead. It would be barbarous to do more than suggest what had killed Gilman. There had been virtually a tunnel through his body. Something had eaten his heart out. Dombrowski, frantic at the failure of his constant rat-poisoning efforts, cast aside all thought of his lease and within a week had moved with all his older lodgers to a dingy but less ancient house in Walnut Street. The worst thing for a while was keeping Joe Mazurovich quiet, for the brooding loom fixer would never stay sober and was constantly whining and muttering about spectral and terrible things. It seems that on that last hideous night, Joe had stooped to look at the crimson rat tracks which led from Gilman's couch to the nearby hole. On the carpet they were very indistinct, but a piece of open flooring intervened between the carpet's edge and the baseboard. There Mazurovich had found something monstrous, or thought he had, for no one else could quite agree with him, despite the undeniable queerness of the prints. The tracks on the flooring were certainly vastly unlike the average prints of a rat, but even Choinsky and Desrochers would not admit that they were like the prints of 4 tiny human hands. The house was never rented again. As soon as Dombrowski left it, the pall of its final desolation began to descend, for people shunned it, both on account of its old reputation and because of the new fetid odour. Perhaps the ex-landlord's rat poison had worked after all, for not long after his departure the place became a neighbourhood nuisance. Health officials traced the smell to the closed spaces above and beside the eastern garret room, and agreed that the number of dead rats must be enormous. They decided, however, that it was not worth their while to hew open and disinfect the long-sealed spaces, for the fete would soon be over, and the locality was not one which encouraged fastidious standards. Indeed, there were always vague local tales of unexplained stenches upstairs in the witch house, just after May Eve and Hallowmass. The neighbours grumblingly acquiesced in the inertia, but the fete nonetheless formed an additional count against the place. Toward the last, the house was condemned as a habitation by the building inspector. Gilman's dreams and their attendant circumstances have never been explained. Elwood, whose thoughts on the entire episode are sometimes almost maddening, came back to college the next autumn and graduated in the following June. He found the spectral gossip of the town much diminished, and it is indeed a fact that, notwithstanding certain reports of a ghostly tittering in the deserted house, which lasted almost as long as that edifice itself, no fresh appearances, either of old Keziah or of Brown Jenkin, have been muttered of since Gilman's death. It is rather fortunate that Elwood was not in Arkham in the later year, when certain events abruptly renewed the local whispers about elder horrors. Of course, he heard about the matter afterward, and suffered untold torments of black and bewildered speculation. But even that was not as bad as actual nearness and several possible sights would have been. In March 1931, a gale wrecked the roof and great chimney of the vacant witch house, so that a chaos of crumbling bricks, blackened moss-grown shingles, and rotting planks and timbers crashed down into the loft and broke through the floor beneath. The whole attic story was choked with debris from above, but no one took the trouble to touch the mess before the inevitable raising of the decrepit structure. That ultimate step came in the following December, and it was when Gilman's old room was cleared out by reluctant, apprehensive workmen that the gossip began. Among the rubbish which had crashed through the ancient slanting ceiling were several things which made the workmen pause and call in the police. Later, the police in turn called in the coroner and several professors from the university. There were bones, badly crushed and splintered, but clearly recognizable as human, whose manifestly modern date conflicted puzzlingly with the remote period at which their only possible lurking place, the low, slant-floored loft overhead, had supposedly been sealed from all human access. The coroner's physician decided that some belonged to a small child, while certain others, found mixed with shreds of rotten brownish cloth, belonged to a rather undersized bent female of advanced years. Careful sifting of debris also disclosed many tiny bones of rats caught in the collapse, as well as older rat bones gnawed by small fangs in a fashion now and then highly productive of controversy and reflection. Other objects found included the mingled fragments of many books and papers, together with the yellowish dust left from the total disintegration of still older books and papers. All, without exception, appeared to deal with black magic in its most advanced and horrible forms. And the evidently recent date of certain items is still a mystery as unsolved as that of the modern human bones. An even greater mystery is the absolute homogeneity of the crabbed, archaic writing found on a wide range of papers whose conditions and watermarks suggest age difference of at least 150 to 200 years. To some, though, the greatest mystery of all is the variety of utterly inexplicable objects. Objects whose shapes, materials, types of workmanship and purposes baffle all conjectures, found scattered amidst the wreckage in evidently diverse states of injury. One of these things, which excited several Miskatonic professors profoundly, is a badly damaged monstrosity plainly resembling the strange image which Gilman gave to the college museum, save that it is larger, wrought of some peculiar bluish stone instead of metal, and possessed of a singularly angled pedestal with undecipherable hieroglyphics. Archaeologists and anthropologists are still trying to explain the bizarre designs chased on a crushed bowl of light metal whose inner side bore ominous brownish stains when found. Foreigners and credulous grandmothers are equally garrulous about the modern nickel crucifix with broken chain mixed in the rubbish, and shiveringly identified by Joe Mazurovich as that which he had given poor Gilman many years before. Some believe that this crucifix was dragged up to the sealed loft by rats, while others think it must have been on the floor in some corner of Gilman's old room all the time. Still others, including Joe Mazurovich himself, have theories too wild and fantastic for sober credence. When the slanting wall of Gilman's room was torn out, the once sealed triangular space between that partition and the house's north wall was found to contain much less structural debris, even proportioned to its size, than the room itself, though it had a ghastly layer of older materials which paralyzed the wreckers with horror. In brief, the floor was a veritable ossuary of the bones of small children, some fairly modern, but others extending back in infinite gradations to a period so remote that crumbling was almost complete. On this deep bony layer rested a knife of great size, obvious antiquity, and grotesque, ornate and exotic design, above which the debris was piled. In the midst of this debris, wedged between a fallen plank and a cluster of cemented bricks from the ruined chimney, was an object destined to cause more bafflement, veiled fright, and openly superstitious talk in Arkham than anything else discovered in the haunted and accursed building. This object was the partly crushed skeleton of a huge diseased rat, whose abnormalities of form are still a topic of debate and source of singular reticence among the members of Miskatonic's Department of Comparative Anatomy. Very little concerning this skeleton has leaked out, but the workmen who found it whisper in shocked tones about the long brownish hairs with which it was associated. The bones of the tiny paws, it is rumoured, imply prehensile characteristics more typical of a diminutive monkey than of a rat, while the small skull with its savage yellow fangs is of the utmost anomalousness, appearing from certain angles like a miniature, monstrously degraded parody of a human skull. The workmen crossed themselves in fright when they came upon this blasphemy, but later burned candles of gratitude in St. Stanislaus's church because of the shrill, ghostly tittering they felt they would never hear again. So that was The Dreams in the Witch House by H.P. Lovecraft. And I do the occasional Lovecraft. I back away from it sometimes because it's been done really well by somebody like Ian Gordon of Horror Babble. But I just felt this is our Halloween special for October 2024, and I am in fact a ghost because I'm not here. It's not Halloween. I'm actually doing a live reading in Whitehaven, so I'm not here. That being said, let me tell you something about Lovecraft, if you didn't know. So Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Phillips with two L's, was born on the 20th of August 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. I'd actually walked through Providence on a really hot day to the cemetery. I want to say Swan something cemetery. It was a long walk right through the suburbs on a blistering day to his grave. It took a little bit of finding as well. Was it a pilgrimage? I don't know. People who'd left offerings to his grave, like ballpoint pens and things. I'm not sure he would have approved of that. I said elsewhere, I think he'd probably prefer a fountain pen of some kind. Something a bit more Victorian. Anyway, so Lovecraft's early life was marked by tragedy and instability. His father was institutionalized when Lovecraft was only 3 years old, and he was primarily raised by his mother, aunts and grandfather. A precocious child, Lovecraft was reading and writing at an early age and showed a keen interest in science, particularly astronomy. You can see that coming through. However, his formal education was erratic due to poor health, and he never completed high school, a fact that would later cause him considerable embarrassment. Despite his lack of formal education, Lovecraft was a voracious autodidact and developed a vast knowledge of literature, science and history. He began his writing career as an amateur journalist, contributing to various publications and joining amateur press associations. It wasn't until 1923, at the age of 32, that he began to publish his fiction professionally, primarily in pulp magazines such as Weird Tales. Throughout his life, Lovecraft struggled financially and never achieved widespread recognition for his work. He maintained an extensive correspondence with other writers and intellectuals, which played a crucial role in developing and disseminating his ideas. He died on the 15th of March 1937 in Providence, having lived most of his life in relative obscurity. I think he lived for a while in New York City, but didn't particularly like it. He was married as well, but I'm not sure that was very successful either. So he was only 47 when he died. Dreams in the Witch House. This story was published in the July 1933 issue of Weird Tales, a popular American pulp magazine that specialized in fantasy and horror fiction. Weird Tales was a significant outlet for many early 20th century writers of speculative fiction, including Lovecraft, of course. The story appeared alongside works by other notable authors of the era, such as Clark Ashton Smith and Seabury Quinn. It was one of several Lovecraft stories to be featured in Weird Tales, which had become his primary market for fiction by this point in his career. After its initial magazine publication, The Dreams in the Witch House was not reprinted during Lovecraft's lifetime. It was posthumously collected in Beyond the Wall of Sleep, published by Arkham House in 1943, one of the earliest hardcover collections of Lovecraft's work. This volume was instrumental in preserving and disseminating Lovecraft's fiction after his death. And if you think about if you go to any bookshop in the English-speaking world, now, and you look on the horror section, you're going to find Lovecraft books, you'll find Stephen King, you'll find Lovecraft, you'll find Bram Stoker, but you think this is a guy who didn't make it at all during his life. And he even spawned that, Call of Cthulhu, loads of movies. There's something about his imagination that has really caught people's imagination, and there's, it kind of echoes down the centuries, decades at least, maybe centuries, in the future. Since then, his story's been reprinted loads of times. Okay. So the Dreams in the Witch House, which you've just heard, in terms of story structure, follows a relatively linear narrative structure, but with increasing complexity and intensity as the story progresses. The tale opens with a detailed description of the titular witch house and its history, establishing an eerie atmosphere and introducing the protagonist, Walter Gilman. Lovecraft provides background information on the house's connection to Keziah Mason and the Salem witch trials, setting the stage for the supernatural elements to come. The exposition focuses on Gilman's academic pursuits and his fascination with non-Euclidean geometry and quantum physics. I'm not sure, is quantum physics actually mentioned by name? I mean, in 33, of course, quantum physics was a thing, it had come out and it was known. It probably wasn't as well known to the general public as it is now. Even though, Niels Bohr said, if you think you know, if you understand quantum physics, you don't. Or something like that. So we start off with that scientific exposition, and we start to set up these scientific concepts that will entwine with the supernatural elements later in the story, creating a unique blend of cosmic horror and speculative science. This is Lovecraft's great contribution, really. This mix of science fiction and horror, cosmic horror. And, the idea is that if you look at the literature terror, which starts in the 1760s, really, as a thing, when they actually start talking about horror, horrible things happen almost in a spectacle, things like Castle of Otranto and stuff like that. And the early Anne Radcliffe books, the Gothic books, they are, and they were criticised for this, for being little more than spectacle. They're not edifying, they just scare you. There was a kind of philosophical defence of terror and horror written by Edmund Burke in 1757, a second edition 1759, called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. So despite the title, he also talks about awe and terror and horror, and gives them a kind of academic respectability, which I think the writers of Gothic horror grabbed hold of. But by and large, they were still in the business of just spectacle. They weren't edifying. They had no moral purpose particularly. It was just like, spectacle is about giving you a shock or a big emotional response with no betterment to it, for any, in want of any better word. And then Lovecraft. I mean, I'm not saying Lovecraft was the first to try and give some depth to horror, but to be fair to him, so let's circle back a little bit and let's talk about the kinds of horror. So one of the main horrors is being predated. So it's this idea, this is an animal horror, that something will come along and eat us. And a lot of horror, and particularly body horror, whereby a lot of horror shows bits of people and of corpses. And this triggers our ancient brain, like the gamekeepers and people and the farmers will put moles and crows on the fences. The moles and crows can't actually see them. I don't know what the moles and crows make of them, but they kept doing them, and the idea was, this could happen to you. So I think one of the primal feelings of horror is being predated. And then we have kind of more existential horror, such as the weird and the eerie. Martin talks about those categories. Freud talks about the unheimlich, the return of the repressed. And these are deeply psychological. But by and large, what Lovecraft's saying is not that there isn't a malevolent devil out there that has your name It's not like earlier stuff though. We talk about a lot of, and even things like The Exorcist in the 70s. You know, the issue is this malevolent and demonic thing knows you. It wants you. You know, we think of Nathaniel Hawthorne, we think of Robert Louis Stevenson, and the stories they wrote about. You know, it was a personal devil was out to get you. Well, Lovecraft's weird cosmic horror is that they don't care about you. They could just stomp on you like an ant in the same way as we might step on an ant, and we might not even notice. It's not that we hate the ants, it's just totally indifferent to them. We have our own agendas. And of course, this is what comes out here. And what that creates is a horror of being utterly meaningless. And if we are not significant in this world, then, and if we don't matter, then the world in a funny way has no interest in preserving us. So if you think about this as little creatures, we are significant to our, if we're lucky, to our parents and our grandparents and our family and maybe our in-group. And they will look out for us because we mean something to them. So they'll look out for us. Now, if we don't mean anything to anybody, who's going to look out for us? Particularly when big, awful, frightening monsters, giants come. Who is going to protect us? And I think that's the root, my take on it anyway. There are many other takes on it, but that's the root of cosmic horror. And let me get back particularly to the dreams in the witch house. So we have him and his weird researches into these bizarre, non-human, non-physical realities that are opened up because of his mathematical studies. And these start mixing with his strange dreams and visions, which become increasingly vivid and frequent, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. And of course, I suppose that's one of the features. A feature of sometimes happens in strong anxiety cases is depersonalization stroke derealization. So these are not uncommon features of anxiety. People have anxiety complexes, and depersonalization means you feel you're not real, and derealization means that you're real but the world isn't real. In both cases, this leads to a lot of anxiety because, like, what can you depend on? And I think that this kind of anxiety is behind a lot of Lovecraft stuff. So, and this is what's happening to Overday Walter Gilman. The appearances of Keziah Mason and Brown Jenkin, the evil Brown Jenkin, who is, he's weird, isn't he? So if you remember Mark Fisher's definition of the weird is the juxtaposition of things that should not go together. So you shouldn't have a rat that has human hands and feet. You just shouldn't. And it's disturbing. And also we have Nyarlathotep, who is one of Lovecraft's cosmic, iconic cosmic entities. And the resolution and the aftermath on Walpurgisnacht is revealed. Gilman's fate's disclosed, and the consequences of the experience are detailed, providing a sense of closure to the main narrative. And then we have a coda or an epilogue describing subsequent events at the witch house when they find these the bones, don't they? And these things that really shouldn't be. They're very hard to explain physically, materially. And Lovecraft is blending horror with science in a way and making it cosmically horrible. So he has his non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics alongside the Necronomicon, so a classic occult grimoire made up, of course, although you can buy a copy now. And so there we are. And so, yeah, and Gilman is a typical Lovecraftian protagonist. He procrastinates, he's unable to act decisively, and this is common for Lovecraftian characters who seem paralyzed in the face of cosmic horror, as they might be. And I wonder if Lovecraft, who suffered from anxiety himself and other nervous disorders, whether it's in some way this represents him, these characters represent him. He also kind of invokes this shadow image of the great monster, which I think is the Predator, and the black man, Nyarlathotep. He is this, and of course, there's so much to say, but you have this idea. People who have schizophrenia very often, always nearly, have, I think always, have ideas of persecution. They feel they're being observed. They feel often that the world isn't real. They're in a kind of Truman Show, and they are being observed. I remember one guy, I was sitting in a ward round, and he said to the psychiatrist completely, "You can see through my eyes." You know, and we of course said, "No, we can't," and he just wouldn't believe us. So they are so surveilled by this shadowy, often they come to you with stories of shadowy people watching them, and they often don't know why, but they feel malevolent, and they could be the CIA or the KGB or aliens or demons, you know, but they are powerful, shadowy creatures, forces that are watching them and take a particular interest in them, which I suppose is the opposite of what I was saying about cosmic horror. But, you know, this is a constant feature of schizophrenia and that kind of paranoid psychosis. You know, I'm a big, at the moment, reading my Ian McGilchrist. Somebody said in one of the comments that they thought the left brain, right brain thing had been debunked. I think the old-fashioned way had, but McGilchrist single-handedly has brought it back as a consideration. And he has a lot to say about being observed and this kind of paranoid psychosis. This is present in Lovecraft throughout, that we are being watched in some sense by hideously powerful, shadowy creatures whose motives we cannot begin to understand. This is why he's great, because who else brings this stuff? So when I did some M.R. James did the whole of his second book, and M.R. James was a bit sniffy about Lovecraft, and Lovecraft wrote an essay called about the supernatural in fiction, and he spoke very warmly of M.R. James. Now M.R. James got a copy of this. He didn't know anything about Lovecraft till this was sent to him, and he was like, you know, he tried to read him, but his prose was impenetrable and barbarous, really. And M.R. James was not a fan the other way. Now, M.R. James also, in my view, has his power through his use of the weird. That is to say, the juxtaposition of things that should not be. In the mezzotint, that thing crawling across the picture. In, which one is it, where the thing comes out of the blob in the ink? They look into, the rose garden? No. Mr. Humphreys and his inheritance. And of course, a whistle, then that awful shuffling thing of linen on the bed opposite. This is weird, and M.R. James has that power. But M.R. James did not create the vision of this cosmic horror that Lovecraft did. This is a controversial thing I'm saying. M.R. James was a much more felicitous writer. His prose was far more accessible and pleasant. I mean, I think Lovecraft kind of must have scoured thesauruses to come up with the most obscure word. And when I did this one in the studio, and you know, you're like, some of these words, has he made these up, or I vaguely remembered them and stuff, but it was hard to do. Anyway, that's me kind of saying nice things about Lovecraft, really. I'm not dissing M.R. James, who was fantastic as well. But, you know, I think Lovecraft really did the thing. Anyway, so this story has been used time and time again. It was Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosity, Dreams in the Witch House in 2023. Atom Brain Games released an adventure based on the story, which also incorporates other material from the Cthulhu mythos. Curse of the Crimson Altar, an episode of Masters of Horror. So, you know, there's all sorts of stuff. This alien geometry stuff, which comes up again, also comes up in The Hounds of Tinderlost by Frank Belknap Long, which I've done as well, which is another story I really like, about the weird angles. And you remember he was really keen on maths and non-Euclidean geometry and higher dimensions, which I barely understand. And then there's the Keeper of Forbidden Knowledge trope, which is in the Aleph of Ep. We talked a little bit about him. which we maybe want to touch about on are, I hate to mention Derrida and hauntology about how the present is haunted by the past, but I'll throw it in. Think about Keziah Mason, Salem witch trials. The idea is that the past haunts the present despite being gone a long time ago, centuries ago, and what we've got is this idea of haunting. This is the idea of haunting, isn't it? A particularly malevolent influence, and this idea of haunting, that there is an evil thing that will remain somewhere, and this is right throughout. The implication is at the end it's still continuing. The workmen find these things. It hasn't gone particularly, has it? And Brown Jenkin and Keziah Mason there, even though they are physically destroyed, because we find their bones at the end, the idea is that they're not gone. So that haunting of ancient evils is one there, There's the other, the price of power and knowledge, which is slightly more subtle. In many stories, M.I. James again, but other people, you find an ancient artifact. You open the grimoire, you learn things you shouldn't learn. This is very Lovecraftian, and you go mad, of course, mostly in Lovecraft. Like the Necronomicon, this isn't particularly, he doesn't find a book, he doesn't find an artifact that gives him this forbidden knowledge, this Faustian kind of knowledge, but there he is signing his name in blood, so the bargain's still implicit, not even implicit, it's explicit, isn't it? Nyarlathotep wants him to sign for this knowledge of the higher dimensions and the ability to move between the dimensions. The price is your sanity and possibly your life. He doesn't talk about the soul, which is very interesting, but certainly your life and your sanity are the deal. So we have the cosmic horror, we have this very tried and trusted idea of a deal with the devil, who is the black man, the Nyarlathotep in this. And then, of course, in terms of the Gothic, of course, most Gothic stories, and I think this is a Gothic story, have a place, an antique place that is a character in it. Think of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, or Hell House by Richard Matheson, or The Castle of Otranto, or in The Monk, the monastery. In Gothic stories, the place where all this happens is old or antiquated and haunted by the past, and by a wicked past as well. This, in Gothic, and the ghost story and the weird fiction are children of the Gothic. The past is a place of superstition and irrationality, and this is what we see, isn't it? So there's a lot to be said about this story, and I think in many cases, I think Lovecraft's imaginative power is undermined by his infelicitous prose. If you like this ornate, squamous, blasphemous, unspeakable, and then he speaks about it, prose, desperately ornate prose, and I actually think this is a guy with no formal education particularly. He taught himself and had a massive vocabulary, and he understands all these words. He's kind of making up for it, isn't he? He's saying, I might not have graduated high school, but look at all the words I know, and I'm going to show you all the words I know. Whereas M.I. James, keep going back to him, he's a provost of a very prestigious school. Was he a master of a college in Cambridge? I forget just now, but he had a very prestigious post at one of the oldest universities in Europe. Everybody knew he was erudite. He didn't have to. He had a massively impressive formal education. He didn't have to kind of deploy all this barbarous language, which is seen as barbarous, really. So that's my long way of saying it's a pity Lovecraft, but he wouldn't have been Lovecraft if he didn't write like that, to be honest. That's his signature, isn't it? But I think he wouldn't have been sneered at as much. And yeah, so that's it really. Happy Halloween. Do I want to say anything else? In terms of the context of 1933, what we've got is what was happening. It was the time of the pulp fiction era. It was at its height in the 1930s. This was during the Great Depression, and the story's themes of cosmic indifference and human insignificance may have resonated with readers experiencing economic and social upheaval. He wasn't a modernist as such. I'm not going to go into modernism, but modernism was a school of writing. Starts in 1910, according to Virginia Woolf, and it's about experimenting with narrative style, so messing around, not just telling a story as a story. You know, my nana used to say she liked a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. Well, the modernists messed around with that. They didn't think you needed to do it. And I, possibly being a child of my time, quite like modernist messing around with these things. House of Leaves I really love, which arguably is a modernist text, or a postmodern text. Anyway, let's not even get into that. But yeah, it's mainly a straight story, but you could argue that there's a fragmented narrative structure and psychological depth, perhaps showing the influence of these times. Freudian psychoanalysis was a big influence on writers in those times. I'm not sure overtly for Lovecraft, but the story's exploration of dreams and the subconscious perhaps reflects that. And okay, there's another thing happening, which going back to Ian McGilchrist. I'm not sure McGilchrist, he never mentions Lovecraft. I'm not sure he'd be a fan. He's far more classical, actually, although he probably he might dispute that. But so what we have is, we have in the Enlightenment, we have the prizing of rationality and thinking of Descartes and all those dudes, and and a repudiation of superstition and irrationality and fantasy. But it keeps coming back. And so this is perhaps the pulp fiction was kind of an underground response to a world that was becoming too rational. There was a guy called Karl Weber, who was a German, and in the 1930s, and he talked about the disenchantment of the modern world caused by our hyper-rationality, and we've taken the magic out of the world, and I think Pulp Fiction, even though it was just read by ordinary folk, is a kind of response to that, in terms of who else was writing in 33. Just for the context, Clark Ashton Smith, who was a correspondent of Lovecraft, in 1933 he published The Beast of Averoigne, which I've done on the podcast if you want to hear, and the Holiness of Azedarak, which I've never read and I haven't done. Lovecraft is perhaps more sensual, also throws lots of prose in. Robert E. Howard at the time was publishing in Weird Tales, more action orientated, particularly people like Conan. August Derleth was also active in 1933. He was a bit of an acolyte of Lovecraft, and Robert Bloch, same kind. They became very influenced by Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a massive influence, really. So is there any more I want to say? Just these from my notes. Looking at Mark Fisher again, another big influence on my thinking in these things. I can't remember what year it was, but in the weird and eerie, 2013 possibly. He talks about the weird and the eerie, and the weird, which is a very Lovecraft. Lovecraft is weird. The presence of the alien, and Fisher defines the weird as that which does not belong. So in the dreams of the witch house, this is exemplified by the intrusion of cosmic entities like Nyarlathotep and the witch Keziah Mason into our reality. Fisher talks about the sense of wrongness. The bizarre architecture of the witch house with its queerly angled walls embodies Fisher's notion of the weird as a violation of our sense of reality. Very much so, and I think that's this whole idea of strange geometries that goes through Lovecraft and his acolytes, as I said, Frank Belknap Long, particularly in that Hounds of Tindalos story. And the cosmic perspective, the vast, incomprehensible cosmic forces meet Fisher's concept of the weird as something that expands our perception beyond the human scale, bigger than us, and the breakdown of categories, the blending of science and magic in the story He talked about Eliza Fisher's idea that the weird involves a collapse of established categorical distinctions. Yeah, absolutely. He would put quantum physics and ritual demonology together. Well, loads of people these days, but when Lovecraft did it, I don't think they did. Anyway, there's actually a lot of stuff. I've got some notes here on that. Gilles Deleuze's concept of the fold, a compelling framework for analysing the complex spatial dynamics in the dreams in the witch house. The fold, as Deleuze conceives it, represents a way of thinking about the relationship between the inside and the outside that goes beyond simple dichotomies. In Lovecraft's story, the witch house itself can be seen as a Deleuzian fold, a space where the interior and the exterior, the mundane and the cosmic, are not simply juxtaposed, but intricately intertwined. The bizarre angles of Gilman's room, which seems to defy Euclidean geometry, exemplify this folding of space, where the boundaries between our familiar three-dimensional reality and other alien dimensions become blurred and permeable. Deleuze's notion that the fold creates an infinite series of curvatures or inflections is particularly relevant to Lovecraft's depiction of interdimensional travel, where Gilman experiences a continuous unfolding of new spatial realities. Moreover, the concept of the fold illuminates how the story treats consciousness itself, with Gilman's dreams serving as a fold between waking reality and cosmic horrors, his mind becoming a space where the internal and external, the subjective and objective, are inextricably entwined. Through this Deleuzian lens, we can understand Lovecraft's narrative not just as a tale of horror, but as a profound exploration of the nature of space, reality and consciousness. So, there we go. You get into this, and you can go right down into rabbit holes. But I think in that rambling and somewhat discursive chat about the dreams in the witch house, there's some really interesting things, and I think it illustrates, despite my frustration, I'm at about an hour, and I'm like, ooh, when is this going to stop? Because I'm in a studio and it's hot, and I need a drink of water, and these big words keep coming at me. I'm like, I wish I'd chosen a shorter story. But on reflection, now that it's done, I think it's a story that has some fairly major things to say. So fair play to old Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Happy Halloween.